Welcome back to the Demystify Sci podcast. I'm Anastasia.
I'm Shiloh.
And today we are talking quantum biology. For that conversation with us, we have Dr. Luca Turin, who has spent his career trying to understand the way that the electrical properties of molecule interface with smell and with consciousness. And these are pretty big topics. And so in order to really lay the groundwork for it, we start by having Dr. Turin lay out his journey into smell science, which doesn't come from a firmly rigid academic background. It comes from just an enormous passion for scents and perfumery, and then develops into this curiosity about, what is the possible mechanism for how this works? And the long and short of it is that Dr. Turin proposes that smell is actually an electrical process where the molecules that are scented have a vibrational capacity to them. And that vibrational capacity interfaces with the olfactory proteins, which are called GPCRs. And that interface between the vibration of the scent molecules and the properties of the protein that they bind to is what's actually creating the experience of smell, which is pretty cool because it's a radical departure from the receptor ligand binding and shape change paradigm that has ruled olfaction for probably since the 90s.
And he goes through the problems with the standard model, which are quite interesting and I wasn't aware of before, down to, the thermodynamics, the energy imbalances that don't make sense. And it's a really cool journey. The vibrational ideas about atomics in general are really interesting to us, and we're having a number of conversations right now. I'm not sure the order all this is going to go out in, but we've talked obviously with Carver Mead about the transactional quantum mechanical interpretation. We just spoke with John Kramer about the same idea. So this idea that there's resonance transfer between these actual physical atoms that are vibrating their electrons, right? The outer surface is doing something. It gets us a little bit closer to understanding the physical mechanism by which all of this spooky phenomena, and we don't usually think about smell as spooky, but it turns out to be quite strange at the end of the day. We actually get a little closer to apprehending a physical mechanism for some of these processes. So I'm really excited about this whole investigation line.
And consciousness too, right? Because we, towards the end of the conversation, get into the question of anesthetics. It is really, really insane that you can take a general anesthetic, go under, experience no pain, have no memory of what has happened, and then when the anesthetic wears off, you still remain as a person.
Not to mention, a lot of your nerves keep working just fine, right? Your heart keeps beating, you keep breathing. It's very, very strange. So it doesn't just turn off all your neurons.
And these anesthetics seem to operate in the same electrically conductive way that the scent molecules do, though the question is obviously much more open in terms of biology, where is that handshake happening?
And what is the electric circuit that's going on? And it involves the mitochondria and the redox states of the cell and a lot of jargony stuff, but ultimately we're talking about a simple circuit between the outside world and the inside world.
And our subsequent experience of it. And so it's just a really cool open book of many different threads that all sum to this idea that there are events happening inside of biology that do not follow the paradigms that we have long proposed that they follow.
And they might teach us something about physics in the process. So it's interesting stuff to us on all fronts. Otherwise, remember, this podcast is entirely supported by listeners. So thank you so much if you are supporting us, if you're one of our patrons. We love our patrons. We hang out every Sunday morning for an hour and chop it up about all our favorite subjects. And we would really love to see you there. So come check out our Patreon page, patreon.com/demystifysci. If you don't have any money to give, consider just telling someone about the podcast who you think might enjoy it, or sharing it on social media. You can leave comments, come over to Discord, come over to Facebook, chop it up with other listeners. We hang out there too. And we would love to see you supporting us in any way that you can, because at the end of the day, the more support we have, the more time we have to put towards this, and the better program it will be.
Absolutely. And so in the meantime, enjoy our conversation with Dr. Luca Turin, and we'll see you next time.
The scientific revolution starts now. The Demystify Sci podcast.
Let us see in the dark.
in the early 1980s, I had a Belgian girlfriend whose mother was an antique dealer, actually a restorer of furniture, but she used to go to the market all the time, antiques market, and she would pick up in those days at virtually for zero money old perfumes. And because I lived in the south of France, and she used to come quite often, and every time she brought me a box of old perfumes, which incidentally today would be worth an absolute fortune, but then they were just practically being thrown away. So I started collecting fragrances, and I found that to me, a fragrance is an absolutely self-evident thing in the sense that when I smell it, it tells me a story. Okay, and I think it's very important to distinguish between a smell and a fragrance. It's exactly the same opposition as between, let's say, a sound and music. Okay, a smell is a smell, and a perfume is smells coordinated by a human hand with a given intent. Okay, so when you fry onions, the onions don't have an intent, but the perfumer most certainly does. So what you're smelling in a fragrance is really two separate things: the texture of the different materials. So if you can isolate them in your mind individually, like this is a great lavender or a good smoky vanilla, whatever. And then there's the harmony and the tune, and of the whole thing. Now, I found that for me, it was very easy to talk about a fragrance. I wouldn't even say describe it, okay? Because describing a fragrance is a harder thing to define. But to explain what I thought the idea was in the perfumer's mind, okay, the abstract idea. And so I was doing this, basically smelling perfumes and telling my friends what I thought they meant. And after some time, when I was living in the U.S. and also there collecting fragrances because the U.S. was absolutely awash with old fragrances in discount stores and stuff. A friend of mine said, I think he was completely bored, with my constantly gassing on about perfume. So he said, I tell you what, why don't you write a book, of perfume reviews? So I went back to France a year later and sat down and wrote a perfume guide. A small thing, 140 something fragrances, published by arguably the shittiest publisher in France. It's actually a printing outfit that only had a publishing wing because they wanted to attend publishing fairs, book fair, to sell their printing services. So anyway, it wasn't a great publisher, but never mind. They published it, and everything sort of snowballed from there. But so all of this happened in 91, 92, published my first guide in 92. And then I had the great good fortune as a result of the guide to be invited to meet various perfumers and to visit the companies where they worked. And so I ended up spending like 2 weeks in the lab, of one of the big fragrance outfits, sitting in a corner, smelling one material after another, of which there are several thousand. I didn't do several thousand, okay? I think I probably smelled 300 or 400 materials, but just to give myself a picture of what smells like what. And I'd had some interest in how smell worked scientifically. And what was clear to me, even then, was that the standard explanation just didn't fly, okay? Simply, some basic facts are not accounted by it.
And what is the standard explanation?
There just couldn't be enough locks to account for all of these smells?
No, it's not that. It's a much simpler problem. The real problem of olfaction is the problem of functional groups. Okay, if you have a functional group, meaning a small collection of atoms that come together and define the chemistry of whatever molecule, the functional groups can be smelled independently, so to speak, from the rest of the molecule. So if you take a aldehyde like cucumber, you replace the aldehyde by a nitrile, you get a metallic cucumber. If you do it with a lemon, you get a metallic lemon. Okay, so nitrile has a character of its own. The same applies naturally to sulfur. SH, the thiol group, has a tremendous character of its own, which it can be found in any molecule. So mercaptopinene is grapefruit, but it's basically pinene plus sulfur. Okay, bucothiol is a what would that be? For black currants and I suppose and sulfur. So the fact that we can smell functional groups, sulfur, nitriles, oximes, um, all tellurides as well. What else? Nitros, alcohols, aldehydes, is an insoluble problem from the standpoint of molecular recognition. Because if you imagine feeling a molecule the way a protein might do it, the way you're going to feel a functional group is by making a hydrogen bond to it. Okay, and you can make hydrogen bonds to many of these different functional groups that are only going to be different in length or in position by a fraction of an angstrom. Okay, so one of the mysteries is why, for example, why does an alcohol that's an OH never smell of sulfur? Since OH and SH have very similar geometries. And conversely, why does a thiol never smell like an alcohol at any concentration? Okay, so this very basic molecular recognition problem has a ready explanation with molecular vibrations, because the functional groups inhabit a region of the spectrum which is away from what the rest of the molecule is doing. It's the upper half of the vibrational spectrum. And the functional groups each have a distinctive vibrational frequency. So in principle, before NMR came along, a chemist would be handed a molecule, unknown, right? Put it in a spectroscope, if you have enough of it, a vibration spectroscope, infrared spectroscope. And you could look at it and you could say, well, oh, there's a nitrile there, or a sulfur, SH, just from that particular region spectrum. The rest is a very complicated spectrum, which you cannot invert. You can't guess the molecule from the spectrum. You can only compare your spectrum to a library of spectra. Okay, so in the old days before NMR, the chemist would eyeball this thing and would say it's a thiol, and let me go and look in the library. Oh, that probably is pinene thiol, let's say. Okay, so in fact, the nose was doing a rather similar thing. It was detecting, on the one hand, the vibrational groups to give the smell character of the functional groups, and on the other hand, what's called the fingerprint region of the molecule, which gives the rest of the smell. So I was really, I knew about vibrational theories, which had been around since depending how you look at it, since the late 20s or the 30s. Okay, various people had suggested that our sense of smell was spectroscopic. And it made sense. That's what chemists did all day, every day, look at infrared spectra. So if it matched it, they would have known. Except for one small problem, of course, which is there was no mechanism that would enable a cell or a protein or a receptor or anything you want to detect molecular vibrations. So this crazy theory got a lot of press in the 60s and then gradually sort of died down in the 80s. Despite some very good experiments, for example, involving isotopes using insects that showed that the insects could tell the isotopes apart. And this is very important because, just as a reminder, if you have a molecule that's made of, let's say, carbons and hydrogens, if you replace all the hydrogens with a heavy hydrogen atom, a deuterium atom, essentially the shape is unaltered to a first order, certainly. And however, the molecular vibrations are all changed by a large factor because of the deuterium has twice the weight of hydrogen. Okay, so there was evidence out there that insects could smell vibrations, but there was no mechanism. And in the end, if you say, well, we smell vibrations, that's terrific. But if you don't have a mechanism, nobody's going to give a damn, especially now. Maybe in the 60s, they might have gone along with it.
Because the idea was always that there's a G protein coupled receptor that matches to the molecule, and then you're saying no.
No, wait. The G protein coupled receptors arrived in 91. The discovery that the nose contained GPCRs was a discovery in 91 by Linda Buck and Richard X.
So then let me take a step back. I would say that prior to that, my assumption is that the paradigm that it was the same bullet target paradigm that happens in all of biology, which is that you have a molecule that has a receptor, and that molecule receptor interaction causes some kind of change inside the cell? Or what was the paradigm before GPCRs were around?
It was a wide range. In fact, the receptor was unknown. So, and there were a number of different theories, some of them actually involving carotene pigments. It was all manner of stuff. I mean, don't forget, all the mechanisms, all this, our actual knowledge of receptors as proteins, not as a black box that you turn on with an agonist, is relatively late. I mean, it's certainly the 80s and the 90s. So all the stuff before that were rather agnostic. They figure there must be a receptor. The word receptor was used to describe an entity of unknown nature, probably a protein, able to bind a thing.
And is that the conventional theory of smell at that
So the
moment?
conventional theory of smell at different times, I think before the receptors actually were discovered, there was no conventional. There was a free-for-all.
I see.
It was a broad assumption that it would probably be some kind of receptor, but that doesn't cost any money to say that, okay?
But something like a fleet of receptors, one for each smell?
Oh, I think people were fairly agnostic. I think because anyone if you think about it for even 5 minutes, you can do an awful lot with 3 receptors, as in color vision.
I see.
We have millions of colors discriminated. So I don't think anybody was going to bet necessarily on a number of receptors at that point.
But I think, you're saying that this idea of the vibrational theory was apparent in the 60s and declined in popularity through the 1980s. And usually when I see that in the history of science, it's because there is some idea that takes over, that becomes the widespread paradigm. Like if you look at geology, you have plate tectonics, you have continental drift, you have expanding Earth. There's all of these competing theories about how the planet was formed. And then there's one that becomes gradually the attractor point that everybody begins to prefer for whatever set of reasons. Sometimes it's evidence, sometimes it's
it's a popularity contest.
Yeah, sometimes it's like the myth that lives inside of the theory that is appealing to people. And so when you say that you saw the vibrational theory show up first in the 1960s and decline in popularity, what is the arc of the state of play?
Well, I mean, your description of the sort of the fight between theories applies in a sort of Kuhnian sense more to the big transitions. The small transitions are occasioned by such relatively trivial things as people dying, so that or ceasing to publish or retiring or something. So many theories survive not because they do well, not because they've triumphed in any scientific fashion, but simply because there's a very, very convincing advocate for them, a really good lecturer or a very good writer, both or whatever. And so Robert Wright, who was really the main advocate for vibrational olfaction from 65 to 85, was an absolutely extraordinary man with enough charisma for like 6 people. And he gave electrifyingly good lectures and wrote terrific books. And bear in mind that, for reasons I don't fully understand, the sense of smell really interests people. There's an odd hunger for information about it out there. And so Bob Wright was writing these books, these popular books, and they were indeed popular. And then he died. And after his death, nobody gave a damn.
That's
So
stunning to me, though, because he was a researcher, so he had a laboratory.
Yes, he was a professor of chemistry and/or entomology at University of British Columbia, I believe.
And so he just didn't have a protege that picked up the torch afterwards.
No, okay, that's a different story. But Bob Wright was working alone, I think.
I see.
I mean, I'm trying to think of his publications. I think there's a couple that have co-authors, but mostly is it by himself.
We've seen this story play out many times.
Yeah. The history of
Well,
science.
it's largely chance ultimately, and some things surface again after decades of, of sort of epistemic blindness to them. You know,
Well, science is much more a social game than people realize when they set out on their academic quest to climb the tower of knowledge, right? I think, people come to us all the time and they're like, how do I publish my revolutionary theory of X, Y, or Z? And it's like, well, you better start making friends with people who are already working on X, Y, and Z, because you need to participate in that discussion, and you need to be well liked and actually be able to criticize people's ideas in a way that doesn't destroy your relationship with them. It's very, very hard.
I think there are in what you've just said, there's several very different things. There's first of all, you need to talk to people to make sure that you got it right and that you're the first to get it right, because history of physics and mathematics is a treacherous thing. Benoit Mandelbrot used to get a lot of mileage from casually mentioning that something that was just being presented at a conference where he was had actually been discovered in 1750. Because he knew the old literature. Okay, so there's, number one reason, if you have a crazy ass theory, talk to the people and ask them whether they've seen it before and whether there's whatever proof or disproof. Number two, yes, you need to make friends, but actually, these days, if you put together a decent mathematical physics paper and you publish it on the archive, okay, and it makes sense, and you publish it from 31 Acacia Avenue, and not some physics department. If it's good, it'll get traction anyway. The world is now very different. So what you're describing is, and rightly so, is the conventional model of publishing in a serious paper. But mathematical physics is now practically free from peer review. It's a preprint only, not completely, but it's more than 50% preprint only. So no one gives a damn about journals in certain areas of mathematical physics. And so my guess is that if you are what I call the kid from Khabarovsk, I call him in my mind, he's a 12-year-old in Eastern Siberia who has won 2 mathematical Olympiads and has a real insight, a Dirac type insight into something fundamental. He or she can post it on archive tonight.
Is that true? I thought you needed an academic affiliation to post to archive.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Or if that doesn't work for some reason, if they turn it down, you can always have a web page and email a couple of big shots. I mean, look, nobody's going to make you necessarily famous, but they can't shut you up completely.
They can't shut you up, but nobody's going to read your mathematical theory of everything unless you have a really good way of interacting and connecting your idea to other people's ideas.
Look, it depends which romantic theory of science you subscribe to. When it comes to history of science, I have to be a theist because the alternative is just too depressing. So out of a sense of aesthetics, I believe that, that ideas have their own life.
For sure.
Yes, having friends will definitely help. Sometimes it might hurt.
Well, I guess the question is whether it happens in your lifetime or not, right? Like you might. I know of a couple of theories that I personally am completely convinced are going to revolutionize their discipline, but those people are unable to reach their peers right now, and it doesn't mean that their idea won't get dug up 100 years from now, 200, when somebody's in the position of being a really compelling writer or a public figure, scientist, somebody who can give great lectures, all these things. Somebody might resurrect, undoubtedly will, in my opinion, about some of these theories that we've encountered. But for whatever reason, and I suspect it's a social reason, that those people are unable to get them in the hands of their peers in a way that doesn't threaten them or set off the immune system of the institutional scientific apparatus.
Okay. Two comments on what you just said. One is that it is an unfortunate accident that the length of a human life is comparable to the time that it takes for people to change their minds. Some people say, like Max Planck famously said, the two are directly related because science advances one funeral at a time. So I don't believe that, by the way. But I do think there's a time constant of people changing their minds, which is quite slow. And then only when a certain fraction of the population has reached a threshold does it suddenly happen. The sort of walls of Jericho thing. And that's one thing. The second thing is what you've described. In the end, I mean, as I said, the fact that human life and change of mind have the same length, roughly, okay, is an accident of biology. If we lived 100 years, okay, the big question: if we live 200 years, would ideas take 100 years to be accepted instead of 20? We just don't know. We haven't done the experiment, okay? But you cannot really. I mean, science is a social game only to some extent, not 100%.
I immediately, as we're talking about this, think of somebody like Graham Hancock, widely reviled by academics, but so beloved because of his ability to weave a narrative that it doesn't matter, because now the academics are always on the back foot being like, no, he's wrong, and defending against the ideas in such a way where it seems to be proof that if you can be charismatic and you can write well and put your ideas in front of people in this captivating way, that it doesn't really matter if the Academy accepts you or not, because that idea gets into the mimetic flow of how people think about history and the world and civilization, where even after you die, I feel like that's going to be around. Sufficient popularity in the public, I think, drives the next generation of scientific theories in an indirect way.
Very, very, very true. In the case of Graham Hancock, of course, he has, I mean, he's dealing with topics that are endlessly fascinating. I mean, let's get it, come on, man. Was there a megalithic civilization? Did the Egyptians have, I don't know what, nuclear power? That kind of stuff. I love that stuff. Are you kidding?
His books are so good. Like, they're so fun to read anyways.
And it's the archaeologists come across as tedious, and I'll bet you 99 out of 100 are. Okay. So, I don't feel sorry for those guys. I mean, the kind of narrative that they are allowed to weave in their own world is really stunted compared to, it may be true, but it's tedious. So it's also partly their fault, I guess.
Right. So there's this like social dimension, and the opposite side of that, which I've seen a lot, is people who have cool ideas, but then they charge into the academic landscape hoping to be accepted and end up just calling everybody idiots and making more enemies than should be even possible, because they have this they have both this hatred for academia and this dire need to be accepted by it at the same time. That's really bizarre.
Every scientist within academia feels exactly that way.
That's probably true.
So they're, in that respect, the Mavericks are not privileged. They feel just as ambiguous.
But to wrap this back to the question of smell, we got to this point where you were saying that you began to dig into the literature for how smell could possibly work. You discovered that this vibrational theory was popular in the 1960s and then declined in popularity in the 1980s, which you seem, if I'm understanding correctly, attribute largely to the fact that Bob Wright died and didn't have somebody to pick up the torch. And then in the 1980s, by like 1991, we have GPCRs. GPCRs are implicated in how smell works, and that's just been the paradigm ever since?
Pretty much, yeah. Pretty much. Yeah, I think that's a fair description.
Can I ask you a question before we get too far away from the perfumes and the fragrances? You used the word harmonizing and you compared it to music. Do each one of these notes actually have a geometric relationship in their vibration to one another in the same way that if I make a chord? No, there's nothing like that.
No, there's no. Okay, let me open a parenthesis on harmony. Okay, as a guy called Bill Citharis in Wisconsin has shown, ultimately our sense of harmony is the result of nonlinearity of everyday objects. When you hit an object, be a piano string or it doesn't matter, a box, a glass, you generate not just the fundamental, but a lot of higher harmonics and partials, and partly it's because the energy is moving up through nonlinearities into from 1F to 2F to 3F and that sort of thing. So in other words, the structure of musical harmony has to do with those multiples. Okay, in a molecule there are harmonics, but you only see them under very high degrees of excitation. The bonds are weakly nonlinear, of course. Every chemical bond is not a perfect spring. It has usually a soft nonlinearity. So normally you only excite the fundamental, but the fundamentals occur at all manner of different frequencies that are not related to each other in a harmonic series.
I see. So you don't see one functional group that's a perfect octave of another or something like that.
Okay, so the only, and this is completely fanciful and probably should be labeled BS, the only accord that I can see that genuinely resembles a musical accord is the ester, because the carbonyl, that's C double bond O, O something, okay? The C double bond O vibrates at roughly 1800, and the COC vibrates at about half that much. So, I'm sorry, two-thirds. So, two-thirds. So that if you are inclined to think like a German philosopher in the 1820s, you will recognize in that a major fifth.
Mm-hmm.
And I swear to you, esters, which is where you find this thing, always smell like a major fifth to me. I realize this could, prove a little, considered a little strange, but that's a fact. They sound. I'm saying sound. They smell like a major fifth.
I mean, the reason I ask is you see them in astronomy all the time, particularly with the orbits of planets, right? They carve out. They also carve out tones that have no relation to our Western scale, but our Western scale is built entirely off that fifth, essentially.
That's right. So what Bill Sitharis has shown by a wonderful inverse experiment is that if you'd make a timbre entirely constituted of weird harmonics, like 1.31, okay, and so on and so forth, you can construct then a completely different harmony using that timbre, which sounds consonant, okay? As if you look at his website, there's one example where he has a cadence, and he's doing it with stretched harmonics, and the cadence sounds just right. That's mind blowing. That's like 3,000 years of geometric bullshit blown away in 5 seconds.
Well, still geometric, just different, I suppose. I mean, honestly, our Western music is pretty beat up. Like, we have a tempered scale, right, for most of our music, and so it's not actually harmonic.
No, it's been hammered into submission. Yes, that's true.
I mean, there's this one guy, there's a cool video everybody should check out by this guitarist. He kind of invented the tap playing guitar style,
Is this Maciek, what's his name?
No, this is Stanley Jordan. But he's gone through and assigned tones based on the ground state of each of the periodic elements, and he kind of constructs some tunes out of it and stuff.
Yes, I've seen
it's
that.
Pretty cool, but it's not a Western harmonic scale. It's it's different.
It's amazing how quickly you get used to weird harmonic scales. You really do. It takes about half an hour, and then they start to sound just fine.
But isn't the pleasantness or unpleasantness of the harmony just to do with the way that the waves phase with each other, ultimately? And so you can pick any fundamental frequency and then work with that?
Well, yes, but the reason things work together, two different notes, is because if your basic tone has a harmonic at 2F, then your other instruments or your other notes that you're playing with it should have harmonics at 2F as well, so that they will, or 3, whatever, the pattern, so they will match. Okay, it's not, how can I put it? It's not the fundamentals that decide harmony, it's the overlaps of the harmonics.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why we have to break the Western scale, because the fifths off of each one of those fundamentals is going to be slightly different. So if you construct a scale off of one note, and so you make this compromise, and actually that means all our music's a little bit out of tune. But
What's interesting is that apparently some many years ago, someone did a study of the concert pianos of great pianists. Because they're tuned each by their own tuner, and they're stored in the great concert halls. So Maurizio Pollini would have had his own piano in London, right? Now, if you actually measure the notes on the piano, allegedly, the fifth is perfect. So they're not equal temperament. It's a different equal temperament called equal temperament with perfect fifths. And the octave is out, and you don't care about the octave. There's an awful lot of do as I say, not as I do in musical acoustics. And the truth is, the pitches are not where you think they are, basically.
But I think this is why I think that humans are naturally attracted to music, right? And I think that there's something about the harmonic nature of reality, even all the way down to the atom, but obviously the planets, there's something about this which we sense and we're attracted to, and it must be the case with smell as well, because smell is a strange dimension of our perception that doesn't get as much airplay as it deserves, I think. Like we're all into, like if you come across a bad smell, that's like, especially like something dead, like you'll never forget that, right? You could come across a beautiful smell too, and you'll never forget that as well. And so there's something really about our conscious experience that involves paying a great deal of attention to smell and finding beauty in it too. And beauty seems to revolve around resonance and around harmonies. And there's something to that I see across. I see there being a music accessible in smells as well.
Yes, absolutely. In fact, when I write about perfume, which I still do, I have a Substack. I sent you the link.
Yep, checked it out.
So the analogies that come to mind are always musical. Well, not always, but 2/3 of the time, musical. I can hear the timbre of fragrance quite easily. Not synesthetically in any way, but I can easily imagine. But what you said about us liking smells a lot. Animals love music. If you play the guitar, I mean, there's lots of videos. One of the great things about Twitter and TikTok is that people are now documenting animal behavior 4 standard deviations out from the mean, so that you see a person playing the guitar and a cow comes and rests her enormous head on her lap and just listens to the music. And the same happens with elephants, with horses, with all manner. So from what you said, if our fondness for music is due to some sort of primeval harmony of the spheres kind of intuition, then cows have it as well, which I think is terrific news.
Yeah, my cat will actually walk out of the room if I play a bad note. It's like no joke, for real.
Yeah. But I guess what I'm saying is that if you're right that this is a feeling of the unity of nature somehow, then animals share that feeling. It's certainly not a human thought.
I actually have a continuous view of humans, which is that we're just this raffinate product of the animal world. And there's no characteristic of humans that you can't find somewhere in some form in the animal realm. So that makes
absolutely.
sense.
Absolutely. I mean, one day we'll understand what dolphins are saying, and then
the game's over.
All hell will break loose. Yeah.
All right, so last perfume question. When you were in that factory where they had all these thousands of different individual smells, were they each pleasant, or were there some that you wouldn't really want to spray on yourself alone?
Well, I mean, in perfumery, in fine fragrance, there's only maybe a dozen things that would be considered unpleasant by themselves at high concentrations, but they're actually quite nice when you mix them. So some of them would be naturals, like ambergris, for example, doesn't smell great by itself. It smells, I mean, I like it, but I'm a pervert, so it doesn't mean anything.
Nasi likes the smell of gasoline, so you're in good company.
I mean, there's a lot of ambergris has a not very nice smell. Indol, in highly concentrated, doesn't smell great. There's a molecule I can't smell called aldron, which smells like stale urine, and they use that in perfumery. Some people, then there's civet, which has amines, And that also goes in perfume. So, but roughly speaking, only the sulfur compounds are hard to handle because they're all uniformly unpleasant at high concentration, but they're used at tiny concentrations in fragrance.
To what end?
Well, a grapefruit, tropical fruit, mango, black currants. Yeah, I mean,
They have like a little bit of a
they all have
funk to
something.
them, right? Like I think
Yeah, they all have
that's
what
smells
we
that are
call
just
funk.
sweet or cloying. Like in one of your blog posts, you mentioned about the detergent smells, where they tried to figure out the problem of when you wash your clothes, they become clean, and so the scents don't bind to the clean clothes. And they found that rose actually bound quite well, and so they were trying to advertise like detergents with rose in them, but rose doesn't convey the smell of cleanliness. Like it's a very heavy, cloying scent as
Yeah, I know.
opposed to like,
But they used a very clever rose molecule called alpha damascone, which has a very lemony version of the rose, not at all the sort of heavy benzenic smell of rose. Damascone is a mouth-watering rose, and that's why it worked.
interesting.
I wonder if there's some element of surprise to it. You know, in music, you use discordant tones now and then because they're a bit intriguing, or they like kind of throw you off a little bit. If you hear music that's overly harmonic, it sounds like elevator music. And so, you know, jazz is, of course, the epicenter of using discordants. And I wonder, I just was curious if there's some,
Oh yes,
that's kind of where I'm digging at.
Perfumery marshals absolutely every trick in the sensory book. Contrast, dissonances, weird relationships, things where the sum of the parts is totally different than the parts. So yes, dissonance is absolutely essential. Certainly in perfumery, many of the great fragrances, through the ages have been intensely dissonant. People have got used to them. You know, Chanel 5, when it was first launched, was considered outrageous because it contained a decent percentage of aldehydes, C10 to C12, and they were really sharp. And now we just got used to it.
By the way, how did all those smells don't decay across the decades? You mentioned finding these old bottles.
So what damages perfume is light. If a perfume has been kept in darkness and sealed, the bottle is properly shut, then it can go on forever.
Wow.
I remember I was at the Hotel Metropole in 1990 in Moscow, and they had a wonderful antique store just below the hotel. So once a week I would repair to the Metropole, have a Negroni, and read The Economist and feel I needed a break from Moscow, so at the time. So I was really having a little bit of luxury. And then I would go down to the antique store that was full of things that I would have loved to take home if I had a truck, namely enormous paintings of young ladies with rosy cheeks on tractors. Okay. Man, I love that stuff. Anyway, and huge furniture. But in that antique store, I found a sealed bottle of a French perfume by Buckingham called Le Parfum Idéal, 1900,
Wow.
unopened, in its original silk bottle. And when I saw that it still had the seal on it, I immediately bought it. A young lady who was selling it, the person who put in there wanted $100, and I said, "Here, it's $100." And she said, "You're crazy." And I said, "No, trust me, I know what I'm doing. This is as rare as narwhal teeth." Okay, and so I brought the perfume back to Paris, gave it to the perfume museum, who promptly analyzed it and everything. It was probably the only sample left at the time of Parfum Idéal. Anyway, so this perfume was in perfect shape. You dipped a strip into it and smelled it. I can't vouch for it being identical to the original, but I can tell you there was no chemical decay at all. It was fresh, just lovely. So 100 years, nothing in darkness.
So it's interesting to me that it would be light that would destroy it. Is it because some kind of photoelectric
And
effect?
oxidation,
Because we're
too.
kind of working towards this idea.
No, it does straight up photochemistry. Photochem. Yeah, so you basically, you have a fair few typically unsaturated molecules with double bonds kind of stuff. If you hit them with light, you may break them or change them for them.
I see. So I'm really trying to maintain this linear narrative because when you get into smells, you've already been doing this casually. You wrote this perfume guide.
Yep.
You've been smelling perfumes. You've been smelling these fundamental scents, and then you decide that you're going to study this scientifically.
No. What happens is I'm going to the library all the time. In those days, there used to be things called libraries.
It's very quaint.
I know, that had shelves and books and stacks and and people. Anyway, so I used to go to the library and read from cover to cover, or as much as I could, a journal called the Review of Scientific Instruments, which is a magnificent journal that describes either new ideas on how to measure something or improvements on an existing method that makes it either easier or smaller or whatever. So I'm leafing through this Review of Scientific Instruments one bright day in '93, and I come across a type of spectrometer I'd never heard of called an electron tunneling spectrometer. And I'm reading this avidly, and they describe, the article is trying to impress upon people that actually it's a fairly easy thing to build, and explains the theory of electron tunneling spectroscopy very well. It's a very simple idea, which they explain nicely. And I'm sitting there and I suddenly realized, dude, this is a nanoscale spectrometer, because tunneling only operates at distances of a nanometer, roughly. Okay, so this spectrometer is intrinsically nanoscale, protein size, number one. Number two, all it requires is electrons, and we've got tons of electrons. Right now, as we speak, your brain is probably using up between 40 and 70 watts of electron currents. In other words, whatever it is, 40 amps under 1.5 volts. 40 amps in your brain right now. And we know that because you're breathing oxygen, okay? So I knew there were plenty of currents. I knew that 1 nanometer was a protein scale. And that paper told me you could make a spectroscope with those two things, an electron current and the right energy levels. And I thought, that's it. That's it. This is it. This is how it works, okay? But the first thing I did was make every mistake imaginable, okay? Because I was learning from scratch, vibrational. Right now, I could find you the vibrational frequency or spectrum of a molecule in about 5 seconds, also because of the internet, but this is before the internet. This all happens BI, okay? So, so I realized that there was one real test which I could devise, which was if I could find something that vibrated at the same frequency as sulfur, SH, okay, then the prediction, a very strong prediction, was that whatever it was should smell of sulfur. And the reason you think that is because the SH vibration is unique. Everything that has it, trivially with SH, smells of sulfur. So why don't we just find something that has the same vibration? But of course, it's like, you only have the elements that you have. And if, it's even with isotopes, finding something that vibrated at 2,500 wave numbers like sulfur was, at the time, for me, non-trivial. But eventually, through a series of lucky accidents, I found it, and it was boron hydrides, BH. Okay, it so happens that BH has the same stretch frequency as SH. So at that point, I embarked on a mini adventure to locate some chemical source that would send me boranes. Boranes are wonderful, fascinating molecules, the weirdest structures you've ever seen. But they are often combustible, in fact, pyrophoric, they spontaneously ignite, and they're also very toxic. So I remember I called a factory that made rocket fuels in the US, and I said, because they use boranes in some rockets. So I said, can you send me a sample of boranes? And the guy says to me, our minimum sample size is 10 tons. because rocket fuel, you go through 10 tons during a 10-second firing or some whatever. Anyway, so I said no, 10 tons is a bit much. But eventually, to my amazement, I found that Sigma, of all people, the wonderful, beloved Sigma, now Sigma Aldrich, and somewhat less beloved, actually now is Merck, so much less beloved. But in those days, Sigma was practically a religion. They made a borane. You could buy a borane, so I promptly bought it. It's decaborane, very stable, nicely stable. And it came, I think, the following day. And I called in a colleague of mine, a Hungarian fellow next door, to come and smell it with me. Because that was do or die, okay? It has the same vibration and frequency as sulfur. It either smells like sulfur or the idea is toast, okay? So we're standing there solemnly, and I have the little decaborane bottle in my hand. I opened it up, and he takes it from my hand and smells it. And I could see he was thunderstruck, and I smelled it. And he said, boiled onions, sulfur compound. Sulfur compound. It smells actually, you know what vitamin B1 smells like? Thiamine?
Mm-mm.
Okay. The decaborane smells very much like thiamine, which has sulfur in it. It's an impurity that you smell. So we were there, we were completely thunderstruck. Here was the Rosetta Stone. I mean, they only had two words, right? Boron and sulfur. But, and so at that point, I became absolutely convinced this thing must be in good part true. Otherwise, I mean, you could imagine a situation where there are two separate systems, one to detect the functional groups and one to do the job with the rest of the molecule. You can't rule that out, okay? But at any rate, the notion that there was a vibrational component in olfaction from that exact moment, day, was clear to me. So that's how it got going.
Okay, so are there other compounds that exist like borane that have the same vibrational stress frequency as the sulfur, or
No.
are boranes are the only ones?
Yeah.
And so do all boranes give the same sulfur smell?
Absolutely. They're well known for being, see, in the literature, they don't say sulfurous, they say unpleasant.
Mm.
What about other functional groups that are characteristic? Do you find vibrational analogs of them as well?
So that's turned out to be right. So if you deuterate the hydrogens, they fall into not far from the nitrile. And in fact, deuterated compounds do have a nitrilic angle, but you'd have to be a perfumer to say to assert that. I don't think the naive person necessarily would see it. But I haven't played very much with. I'm trying to think. Phosphine, the pH bond, is close to the 2500, and does have a garlicky smell. So that's another. But it's that we don't know how wide the spectral domains are.
But I mean, I think that what Shiloh is asking was for, let's say, an ester. Is there a vibrational frequency that is similar to an ester that is not an ester that still smells like one?
Yes, I've made some. Absolutely.
I see.
Yes, you can make a perfectly good ester with a CN group instead of the C double bond O. Of course, it's terminal. So yes, I've made some pseudo esters that are very fruity and have a 2000 to 900 instead of 1800 to 900, a couple of vibrations.
And so the scientific story of this goes that you formulated this idea, you published it, and then people carried you on their shoulders through the halls of academia, and now everybody agrees that it is the vibrational theory.
Not quite. But thank you. It had a huge impact because, again, through a mysterious agency, the BBC did a 1 hour Nova Horizon on it in '95, before it was even published. And this was completely extraordinary. I mean, I certainly hadn't expected it. It was an enormous piece of luck. Of course, made me a million enemies in academia, but whatever you do, that's going to happen. So you might as well do big, you know. Um, that was a sign of the thing that we've talked about before, which is a generalized interest among the lay public for smell. And, you know.
Did you seek them out, by the way? Or did they come to you, the BBC?
Oh, a student of mine at the time ended up working as a researcher for this BBC science unit, and she drew their attention to this.
Gotcha.
It was pure accident, and not just, I mean, accident. Put it this way, this was a good story. Let's not forget that. Yeah, in the film was very very much romantic. Okay, you know, lone scientist cracks eternal mystery kind of thing. It was really, really fun. But because it had the perfume angle as well, there were a lot of really nice shots in perfume labs and perfume stores. You know, it wasn't all science. It had an angle that many people could relate to.
I mean, smell is very aesthetic.
Yeah, I mean, everything. I mean, yes. I mean, like, it's an art, right? So that's what it's about. Perfumery, that is. Or for that matter, arguably, cooking is perhaps the primordial smell art.
So, as far as I can tell, there's still a lot of arguing in the scientific community about whether or not the vibrational theory is accurate.
There's no arguing. People from outside science think that people argue. They do sometimes. Often in the beginning of a clash between theories, but in this particular case, no one's arguing. They're just waiting for evidence. So the job of a scientist is always goes in two opposite directions. One is you propose your new whatever thing, and the other one you tried your best to demolish the old one, to show what it can't do or why it's inadequate, whatever. I think I've done the demolition part really well, because right now nobody who knows anything about it will say there's only one theory. They will, you know, if the people, it appears that a fraction, I don't know how big, because of course I'm not counting them in any scientific fashion, a fraction of the olfaction people who do not have a particular skin in this exact game, okay, who are simply reading the literature, are aware of the fact that there are two theories, okay, and that's step one. For there to be a step two, there has to be new evidence. So I'm not surprised that people, I mean, look, you say sort of disagreements or arguments. There's no argument. People don't argue.
Well, I'm thinking specifically of, this 2015 PNAS paper that had a refutation where the group that refuted it was really interesting, because they're basically like, Turin is wrong, and Turin is wrong because of, these, like, they make a statistical argument, and they also test their compounds in these cell lines. And they're like, we don't see a difference between the hydrogens and the deuterated compounds. And I was really amused, because I think that you made the comment where you were like, well, the smell difference is apparent. And they're like, we're in the business of science. We don't smell things. And I was just so amused by that, because testing a theory like this in a modified kidney cell line that's expressing GPCRs, and then saying, we don't see the difference and we're not going to smell it to see if the difference is there, to me seems like a weirdly prejudiced approach, because the smell is the whole thing. It's not just
bad sportsmanship.
It's bad sportsmanship, feels like.
There's many layers to that particular 2015 sort of back and forth. Some of them are political. They have to do with the personal history of the people involved. I don't really want to go into that because it's all dirty linen. I mean, I've seen every piece of dirty linen, but it's not that interesting. The 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 sort of ferocious, if you want, editorial essentially in PNAS. I mean, this is when you become a member of the National Academy of Sciences, you're essentially allowed one opinion article that nobody's going to question your right to say it. And Professor Vosshall, Leslie Vosshall, used that opportunity for this thing that you've described. But the mere fact that she did that, she's an absolutely eminent scientist. She's probably the maybe second biggest shot in the field of olfaction. The fact that she spends 2.5 pages of PNAS to swat this troublesome fly tells you the fly must be an interesting fly.
Mm.
Okay, so a lot of people reacted to it by saying, "Wait a minute, what is this? Why is this eminent member of the National Academy of Sciences taking the time to do this? Why? What's the problem?" Okay, so actually, it probably got me more readership than it was a sort of Barbara Streisand effect.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not complaining, but Leslie Vosshall is really not stupid at all, and she made one crucial comment, which I don't think was much noticed, which was this. Essentially, I paraphrase. She says, what Turin is saying is that GPCRs are, for smell, are electronic devices. The electrons have to flow. We know for a fact, I'm quoting from her, we know for a fact that electrons are not involved in other GPCRs. And it seems preposterous for evolution to do a completely new type of GPCR for one of the senses. Okay? And those are perfectly reasonable arguments. Okay? So when I saw that, I thought about it for some time. And what I think needs to be investigated, in fact, that's one of the things I'm doing now, is the possibility that actually all GPCRs are electronic devices. Okay. So the way I'm going about testing or trying to confirm my theoretical insights is a completely roundabout way, which is to say, wait a minute, okay, she's right. The other GPCRs also work with electronics. This is a subtype of electronic device. And so, okay. And so that's where I am now, trying to basically turn the tables on it in a scientifically interesting way. So,
can you remind me of some other Sorry, I can't even say that word.
GPCRs?
Yeah, what are some standard ones?
Every time you kick a stone, there's 3 GPCRs that run away from it. The GPCRs, well, the largest family is olfactory receptors, okay? There are several hundred. But serotonin, dopamine receptors in the brain, all those.
Gotcha.
Peptide receptors, GPCRs. The ones that aren't are there's a glycine. GABA is not a GPCR. Okay, but the majority of receptors in the brain are GPCR.
Okay.
I just had this thought as you said that something that's really been eating at me is that a lot of psychedelics are serotonin receptor agonists.
Yes, not a lot. Some.
Interesting. I thought that was like the LSD and psilocybin and DMT, this like major class. They're
okay. Yeah, definitely LSD. But if you actually look, now it's possible to do very, very good assays of the affinity of a drug receptor interaction for 200 receptors, different receptors. You can do that. If you look at the profiles of the major hallucinogens, they will bind, some of them will bind very strongly to serotonin, 5-HT, 5-HT2, 5-HT3. I don't remember which subtype. But some don't. I mean, salvinorin, for example, powerful hallucinogen, arguably the most powerful, binds to opiate receptors in a different part of the brain. So one of the more sort of distressing, really shorthand type thinking that people have about the brain is, people say, oh, this thing gives me a dopamine hit, dopamine hit, that kind of thing. That's such bullshit. Or serotonin has to do with depression. It's just such bullshit. It's a shorthand for not saying anything new, you know? When you say I feel down, my serotonin must be down, you're not adding any new information, because actually your serotonin could be up, down, or sideways, and you wouldn't know. And a lot of the stuff, for example, the serotonin reuptake inhibitors that are supposed to alleviate depression, they do alleviate depression. Do they do it by being SSRIs? Probably not. So our knowledge of neuroscience, I mean, considering the complexity, the number of different receptor types and subtypes, the fact that you have whatever 10 to the 11 neurons, each has whatever. Any statement that says dopamine makes you feel good is likely to be wrong.
That's probably true. I was simply thinking about it in terms of the electric effect of something that binds to the receptor being the mediator for the hallucinogenic experience, which it's totally out of left field. But because I was reading about this and I was trying to get to the bottom of like, why does LSD cause these massive effects where if it's just the receptor and it's just binding to LSD, then technically you would expect that if you gave a massive dose of serotonin, that the binding to the receptor should also result in a similar level of hallucinogenic effect. And there's two options. One is that the hallucinogenic compound is doing something that we have no idea of what it's interacting with. But the other, which I'm thinking about in context of what you're saying about GPCRs being electronic devices and serotonin receptors being one of them, is that this electrical resonance is different when it binds the receptor. And so that electrical resonance is the grounds for the hallucinogenic experience.
Okay, I don't know about hallucinogens.
I was really frustrated the other day when I was trying to get to the bottom of it, because it seems like a lot of them just end at, well, it binds this receptor. And I'm like, well, that's weird. That doesn't seem to be sufficient for the experience that it provides.
We don't know what would be sufficient or not. There's some evidence that hallucinogens enable more connectivity in the cortex, but I don't know. I'm not sure how to interpret it. How can I put it? The effects that you can get by stimulating the brain directly are so amazing, that, stimulating one part of the brain causes, either fear or tremendous pleasure, in this midbrain stuff. Doing it chemically, the fact that you take LSD and all this shit happens is pretty much par for the course for such a complex system. Okay. So with something like the brain, anything is possible, really. Even up to and including people like Ramanujan guessing completely insane properties of numbers. You see, this is something that really bugs me, and I'll explain to you very simply. When you find someone like a genius like Ramanujan who can do something that we can't do, right? There's 2 points of view. One is we all have the Ramanujan computer, but it's not turned on. In other words, we're all human. His brain is no different from mine. There might be a drug or a kick up the ass or something or a bang on the side of the head that would cause me to suddenly turn on like a broken radio and be Ramanujan from then on. Okay. That's the sort of hardware idea of the brain. But the other one is, no. He's always been interested in numbers. He's taught himself a lot of stuff. He has some kind of proprietary algorithm which allows him to make these conjectures and so on and so forth. It's software, and therefore, if you can't code that inside your own head, you'll never get there. Okay. Now, the distinction between these 2 points of view hasn't been really explored. We simply have no idea whether we all have a Ramanujan. There are indications that some people, after concussion or incipient dementia in some cases, become enormously talented at one thing or another.
Yeah, we had one of those guys on the show the other day. It's fascinating. He was like a bartender who got beat up, and I don't think he was a bartender. He was
a futon salesman.
He was a futon salesman. That's right. It became kind of mathematical genius afterwards.
Exactly. So what that tells you is that our basic understanding of how the brain works is so flawed that no one can put any limit on it, for sure. And in particular, if you take a hallucinogen, you could be tweaking some little button at the bottom somewhere, and that's enough to change everything. I'm not surprised.
But in terms of demonstrating that all GPCRs are electronic devices, what's the approach that you're taking?
So the approach that I'm taking is actually comes from a lot of density functional quantum chemistry calculations that I've done over the years for other reasons. But it became clear to me that if you were going to let us suppose that you're going to use electron transfer for a non-smell receptor, okay? How will it differ from the smell receptor? Well, it's quite simple, really, because imagine you have a molecule that binds to the receptor and it carries a positive charge, let's say. And that positive charge is going to lower the tunneling barrier very considerably. So the moment the molecule binds, and it binds specifically due to its shape, okay, the receptor has to have the right groups and the right orientation for the thing to bind. Once it's there, it's the charge, not the shape, that causes electrons to flow, because normally there's no positive charge. Now, consider this. 99% of drugs known are alkaloids. And by alkaloid is meant that they carry a nitrogen group, which is usually charged. So perhaps the most common feature of CNS drugs is the positive charge, which is exactly what you'd want if you were going to change a tunneling parameter by a large factor. Okay.
And by tunneling, you just mean the conductivity of that
well, receptor? I mean, if an electron gets to a gap from one side and extends its wave function such that there's a small overlap on the other side that it can jump, that is going to be helped enormously by lowering the barrier between them. Okay,
which makes it more conductive, effective.
And the best way to lower the barrier is to have an electrostatic interaction in the barrier that favors electron transfer. So a positive charge.
Sort of like transistors.
Exactly. It's a similar thing. So what does that mean? Well, it means that what is it that makes a molecule turn on the receptor and a molecule turn it off? Okay, what's different about them? Well, you could imagine a situation where you have a molecule that binds the electron instead of lowering the barrier. Okay, in that case, it would act. I don't know. It might be an inhibitor. It might be an agonist. It would definitely have an action on the receptor. So the crucial step is this: if a drug molecule, attracts an electron sufficiently to become a free radical, okay, its structure will change because the extra electron causes a reorganization of the orbitals of the molecule. And so the molecule, not all molecules, but many, will actually change shape. So how does that help us? Well, very simple. In the last 5 years, something like, 200 GPCR structures have been solved by crystallography, and something like 30 or 50 of them, I don't know the exact number, have a drug in the structure. Question: is the drug present in the structure consistent with a charged molecule, or is the structure consistent with it being a radical? Has it eaten up an electron? And can we see it in the structure? And the answer is, in 5 cases, the answer is yes. The drug is unquestionably, especially in 3 cases, unquestionably present as a radical. Okay? So, so crystallographers go all kind of funny when you say this to them, because on the one hand, they're utterly dogmatic about the atom positions that they've determined being the correct ones. And on the other hand, if you say to them, well, that thing's a radical, they say, well, how do you know? It's like, well, because the coordinates that you give me after refinement do not correspond to where these damned atoms are. Oh, well, shit happens. But actually, it's not so. It really is meaningful. But there's no real point in debating even all this, because it's a very simple experiment, which is currently, I think, being done by a colleague in Germany, which is that if you suspect that a GPCR contains a drug that is itself present with an electron added to it as a radical, put it in an electron spin spectrometer. If there's spin, it's a radical. Okay, so this is the simplest experiment. Once you have the receptor with the drug on it, which is the hard part, you just drop it into an ESR spectrometer, press the button, and if you see spin, that's it. So that's what I'm up to.
I mean, do you have a hypothesis about what would there be inhibitory effects expected with the radicals versus the positive ions? Would be more. Is there something like that?
Yeah. You could have a negative radical if you start from a neutral molecule, and that would be a very strong antagonist. That kind of stuff. You can start playing games, but first, let's just step one.
And so the hope is that you can show that there is electron transfer there of some kind in all GPCRs.
Exactly.
And so, but you're saying that there's been 200 or so that have been crystallized, 50 of them that have the molecule in the pocket, and then only 3 of those that appear to have an electrically...
No, the problem is that adding an electron to most molecules makes no difference to the structure.
I see. So it has to be this very
Only a small subset. Only a small subset of these little guys really change shape when you put an electron.
And man, that sounds like such an uphill battle to fight, right? Because at each point you show that it works for this receptor, and then the next argument...
No, look, if there's spin, if my German colleague finds spin in a receptor that has, as it happens, a dopamine ligand on, then the shoe's on the other foot.
Why is that single proof enough?
Because spin has no business being in a GPCR unless electrons are being shifted around.
Just because it's an unstable situation.
No, it's because all of pharmacology is closed shell pharmacology. Okay, electrons in pairs with opposite spins. There's very little pharmacology of a spin-containing species. So, from the standpoint of GPCR of the shape theory, there is no chemical reaction at all. Okay, This is akin to a chemical reaction because the receptor is actually interacting with the ligand to change its chemical and physical properties. Okay, this is complete anathema.
Because GPCRs they're supposed to be purely shape-based, right? Like the paradigm is that it binds this shaped molecule, which changes the Go ahead.
A lock and key kind of thing.
Hold on, you're forgetting there's the underpants, so to speak, stage before there's money, right? It's like the little dwarves, The ligand binds, and then a miracle happens, and the conformation of a receptor is different.
Mm-hmm.
But the miracle happens is the part where you say, well, how does the binding of the ligand cause the conformational change? Conformational change is known to exist. The binding of the ligand is known to exist. The part that's missing, the underpants part, is how does the binding actually cause a conformational change?
Isn't it supposed to be like the hydrogen bonds pull the sheets over the person?
There are some incredible. I mean, people have done molecular dynamics until the streetlights dimmed. Okay, and you get enormous trajectories, and given the state of current computations, you get whatever a few nanoseconds, and they see things in there. But as far as I'm concerned, it's tea leaves.
Because you do see it pretty well in other aspects of biology, right? Like antibody binding, things like this.
Oh, wait. There are some perfectly good instances, of course, of allosteric action. And although...
Shape-based stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Although I would venture to say that um, I'm not sure there's a single instance, I'm not up with the literature, but I don't think there's a single instance of you have a molecule that exists in two conformations, depending on whether it's bound or not to a ligand. Okay. You put the structure of that molecule into a molecular dynamics code, you put the ligand in, and it achieves a change in structure. I don't think I've seen that. I could be wrong. If somebody who's listening to this podcast has a reference on this, I'd love to see it because I don't think it's been done.
I think there's a lot of rafting going on with these in the immune cells. Like the little portions come and once you bind one.
The immune thing, no one's asking for a conformational change.
Right. I guess the surface is changing, but
you're only concerned with binding. Now, I'm talking about instances where the binding of a small molecule influences a big one to change conformation.
So, okay, my first question for this is, do you think that this is a universal mechanism for all shape change receptor ligand interactions, that they're all electrical? No. Just the GPCRs. Why just the GPCRs?
Or some fraction of the GPCRs. I'm sure nature can turn it off,
Okay, and so what sets up the necessity for it being electrical rather than just shape-based?
Well, so that's an interesting one. I think it's because the shape is just insufficient to cause the conformational change. Ultimately, you're asking 5 hydrogen bonds to cause the rupture of 20 hydrogen. And there's always been, in my mind, a bit of energy conservation problem there, a bit of a thermodynamic problem.
The rupture being the reforming of the bigger.
Yeah, so you got, let's say you have GPCR, the 7 transmembranes and things. It goes from click to click. If you actually do you see that lots of hydrogen bonds being broken. Bear in mind, this is dissipation. There's no, the breakage of a hydrogen bond and a shift from one atom to the other is a dissipative mechanism.
It's got to be. Unless you're feeding it.
So if you're looking at, on the one hand, how what the molecule has in its power in terms of binding energies and that kind of thing, and what happens to the protein, there's in my opinion, a discrepancy, such that because we're talking multiples of kT, right? So talking 25 millielectron volts, hydrogen bond is maybe 100 millielectron volts energy. But with electrons, you have 1.5 volts on tap. You can reduce a disulfide bridge. You can do big chemical changes like that. You're not messing around with non-covalent. In fact, you do a covalent. So
are you just talking about the charge, the potential across the cell membrane at this point?
No. I'm talking about in cells. That's an ionic battery. So the potential across the cell membrane is determined by the fluxes of ions across it. No, I'm talking about electron currents which take place in mitochondria, but are ultimately the result of metabolism. The whole respiration of the respiratory mechanism of a cell, the electron transport chain, is under roughly 1.4, 1.5 volts.
Okay. How's that getting tapped by the receptors?
Well, the cell is full of soluble electron donors, NADH, NADPH.
Gotcha.
Various other molecules.
FAD, glutathione. There's like a whole collection.
Yeah, that's right. They are hydrogen atom donors. When you look at the Krebs cycle and that dreadful target center of all metabolic charts, which is such a
memorized it and forgot it several times in my life.
I know. All these isocitrate, mevalonate, blah, 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 blah. It doesn't actually matter a damn what the hell they are, because the essential thing, which has never been taught to me properly, is this: dehydrogenase is everywhere, right? Dehydrogenase. What's a dehydrogenase? I never really asked that question because I tended to go into a coma during biochemistry lectures, but it's only much later I realized that a dehydrogenase is actually removing a hydrogen atom, not a hydrogen molecule. And a hydrogen atom, as far as metabolism is concerned, is 1 proton plus 1 electron, okay? So if you take those two things and you dunk them in water, what happens is the proton goes straight off into the water because water is a protic solvent, conducts protons like mad. And the electron has to go somewhere, and it goes into a protein and ultimately to oxygen, which is what we breathe. It goes into the mitochondrial electron transport chain. Or it reduces a disulfide bridge, or that kind of thing. And that can be used for control.
Yeah, I think that's...
So water plays the role of the wire here in some sense.
No, well, it's weird. There's two wires, really. There's almost like an earth electrode, which is the water, and then there's a wire which contains electron.
I mean, the thing that you say about the dehydrogenases and these hydrogen shuttles as being the key to metabolism is something that I came across really directly because I did my PhD in like bacterial electrochemistry.
Oh, wow.
And
okay.
I remember...
Tell me all about it.
I remember that moment of realizing that the entire system was set up to produce these shuttles. I'm like, you're exactly right, that this central thing that's drawn at the heart of every single metabolic chart that's like the size of, an 8x12 poster is there specifically to produce these things which are moving all around the cell and permitting all of this other chemistry to happen.
Absolutely.
It's like a wiring diagram.
Because I think part of the problem is that biochemistry is chemistry, but it's certainly not electrochemistry. So the people who teach you biochemistry, the moment it gets to that bit where it becomes electrochemistry, namely the electron transport chain and oxygen reduction, they kind of, you can't go there. It's closed on weekdays. And
Nasu knows the pain of trying to go there firsthand.
it's really interesting because even plain old electrochemistry itself, when you talk to chemists and you say to them, why are you guys, using these expensive rhodium catalysts where you could do it with a big fat zinc electrode and a hand crank? Oh, electrochemistry. Nobody wants to change large lumps of zinc every other week. Also, you could get an electric shock. That kind of stuff. But really, it's a visceral reaction. And I think the same thing happens in biology. When you get into the electrochemical side of biology, or the biological electronics side, as I sometimes call it, then people get really frightened.
A really quick interruption. If you are listening to this podcast and you have listened to a couple episodes and you've been enjoying it and you've been wondering what it is that you can do to help us grow, consider coming over to patreon.com. We are currently exclusively listener supported and we would love to keep it that way. In return, you get both episodes early and you get to join our Sunday patron chat where we get together and we talk about all of the things that drive our curiosity. It's a really cool scene and we really hope to see you there. So come on over to patreon.com/demystifysci.
You have a machine consisting of whatever the number of gross subunits is, but basically 100 proteins all linked together, optimized through evolution to do one particular thing, right? Transporting protons and reducing oxygen. And it doesn't really work when you split it in parts. It has to all be there in order to work. It's inside the membrane, so it's relatively inaccessible. And you have 100 and something enzymes, all these steps, and you have 4 miserable drugs. 4 pharmacological agents that screw things up. Okay. Now that's like having 27 equations, and you only know a tiny number of variables. And so mitochondria, the study of mitochondrial biophysics really is an absolutely heroic struggle with nature.
So in bacteria, we operated mostly in producing mutants. I mean, that's the nice thing about bacterial systems is that you can make mutants, you could test to see like what they react to, what they don't react to, but it's such a primitive approach to this day. Massive chemical screening processes where you're hoping to see some gross morphological difference. Sometimes we would use oxygen sensors, but the oxygen sensors are for the entire colony, right? Because you're looking to see how the metabolism changes through depth, and you're taking the secondary readout for, well, okay, how does the environment of the biofilm change when you start to screw with metabolism? And it gets to be really just, it's a very remote discipline. Like, I don't know, do you know Nick Lane? He's a
good friend.
So we had Nick Lane on the show a long time ago, and he said something really interesting, which still rattles around in my brain, where he's like, so We have this model of metabolism, which is that there's this reservoir of protons, and the protons fall down through this ATPase, and that's how you produce ATP. And the tricky thing is that there's nowhere near enough protons in the intermembrane space to actually make that go.
Look, he and I have long discussions, and I dearly love the man. But the other day he told me something absolutely amazing, because I was, like everybody, under the impression that it was the proton gradient. Okay, so I was complaining to him about this weird thing that mitochondriacs, as they're known in the trade, what the mitochondriacs have done for decades is add up the gradients, so that if you have a concentration gradient of 10 to 1, that's 58 millivolts. And then if you have a voltage gradient of 100 millivolts in the right direction, you add them up to find what the driving force on the particular thing is. You can't do that. It's been known. I mean, it's not an arcane result, but you just can't do it. Those are two different things, apple and oranges, okay? But then Nick Lane told me the most astonishing thing, because I said, "Oh, it's the gradient of protons that drives the ATPase?" And he says, "No, not really." I said, "What do you mean, not really?" And he says, "Actually, even a very steep gradient of protons will not make the ATPase turn unless there's a voltage." And so that's why collapsing the voltage on mitochondria, keeping the gradients essentially unchanged in the short term, stops ATP production. So the F1 ATPase is a mixed engine. It's an electrostatic engine of some kind with a proton component. Now, you don't see that written anywhere much.
It's too esoteric, and I think that it's so poorly understood too, right? Like if we had okay, so if you start talking about electricity, and you talk about electricity as the flow of electrons, there's also this like really unpleasant feature, which is that in a wire, electrons flow far, far slower than the speed at which current flows. And there's a lot of different ways in which that's massaged into making it make sense. And so there's accommodations for why drift speed and current speed aren't the same. But to me, it suggests that perhaps we don't have a very good model for this. And the reason that we still talk about it in these almost medieval terms of a 30,000-foot view is because when it comes down to it and we're like, okay, well, why is the voltage necessary? You start to get into these really into these places where you have to have a physical model for things that don't currently have a good physical model.
Yeah, I agree.
And so biologists are thrown out of the room by the physicists, or they escort themselves out of the room, because this is exactly where my project ran up against the greatest difficulty, was I was like, what does it mean for this molecule to be charged? What is physically happening in this exchange? What is physically happening to the molecule that causes it to change its conformation or its color or its resonance or whatever else?
Like, what does it physically mean to pick up an electron? Like, what is that, you know?
Because we've abandoned this idea of the bowling balls a really long time ago. And so now it's just this kind of like goopy resonance.
Okay. At the single molecule level, if the molecule is reasonably small, you can quite accurately calculate the electronic structure of the molecule with and without an electron. And you can look, and this is with density functional theory, which for small molecules will give you pretty accurate benchmark results against chemical experiments. So you can look and see where the electron goes. And after a while, when you look at a lot of these molecules, you start to get a feel, of, I mean, I'm not a proper chemist, so I actually get less of a feel about it than just about anyone. But the quantum part becomes not a huge problem. There are definitely problems in understanding driving forces in biology. Entropic driving force is a huge thing, and then the enthalpy, or whatever you want to call them, proper old-fashioned forces like electrostatic forces and so on. So, but there's no complete barrier to understanding or to modeling. I don't feel okay. The only part of, if you want, of bioelectronics that is actually undergoing a revolution is the question of the spin of the electrons. So what is the behavior, the spin behavior of electrons when they move through proteins? And colleague of mine, Ron Naaman, absolutely brilliant guy, who works at the Weizmann in Israel, discovered some years ago that when electrons travel through a chiral phase, the spin becomes oriented in the direction of travel. And this is very interesting because you can safely assume, I think in fact there's good experimental evidence now, that electrons in biology will be spin polarized because they're traveling through a chiral phase. Right. And so what does that mean to biology? What, is that a good thing, or has biology made use of this? And one of the wonderful discoveries is that oxygen is as you know, is a ground state triplet. In other words, the two electrons in the higher orbital, in the highest occupied molecular orbital of oxygen actually occupy different orbitals, and they're parallel to each other. So oxygen is paramagnetic. And this means that Michael Faraday could take a magnet and in 1830 attract a soap bubble full of oxygen to the magnet, okay, in front of an audience at the Royal Institution. So we've known that for a long time. What's really interesting about a paramagnetic ion like oxygen is that if you want to reduce it with two electrons, as indeed happens during respiration, you best put the two electrons, make sure that they come with the same spin, okay? Because that way it'll fit the two parallel spins of oxygen perfectly, and boom, the reaction of oxygen proceeds extremely fast. Because the two electron reduction proceeds with a good spin balance. Okay. So this is a discovery by Ron Naaman, the same person I was talking about. But he and I together did a piece of work where we showed that in electrochemistry experiments here, that when you put general anesthetics, the spins are scrambled. Coming out of the electrode. They get scrambled by the general anesthetic. And this is really, really interesting for a whole bunch of reasons, but because it connects, if you want, neuroscience to electron spin physics in a rather, we don't know how direct, or indeed we don't know what the steps are between the two, but at least they're mentioned in the same breath, which is already a wonderful thing.
And this connects to the free radical charging ideas too, because you have unpaired electrons as well.
Yes, vaguely, distantly connect. Let me tell you about what the general anesthesia field is undergoing revolutions from all sides. From the practical side, several things have become clear in the last decade that are important. One is that if you have a general anesthesia after age 70, you never come back 100%.
Oh, no.
Don't let anyone fool you. A general anesthesia after age 70 is bad news.
But not before?
Before you just recover, except if you're small children damaged. But for some reason, general anesthesia of older people can accelerate, for example, incipient dementia very rapidly. It's really bad news. So advice to all listeners, whenever possible, ask for an epidural. If you're going to have a lower half of your body operation, don't go for a general, ask for an epidural. I guarantee you the surgeon will say no, but insist. And that will not cause any long-term problem. So that's one aspect of anesthesia. The other aspect is all the good anesthetics of the last 50 years are being banned because of environmental reasons. Because they're all fluorinated and brominated ethers.
What makes them good?
What makes them good is we've used them in 10 million operations with only a 0.01% mortality. I mean, it's entirely empirical. We've been there. It works. Anesthesiologists know what to do. They know how to monitor the patient. So
this
they're
seems
safe.
to be an overfitting of concern, because I'm like, how many surgeries are being performed that the amount of anesthetic that's being produced / released is making a significant contribution. That's insane. I had no idea.
It is absolutely insane. I agree. I think that's one of the craziest effects of the green movement that I've ever heard of. Because no one does, it's not like driving a car at CO2 and all that stuff. No one does a general anesthesia for fun. You know what I mean? It's like,
I'm sure there's
there's
a
a good
dentist somewhere that does.
sometimes, but there's a good
Michael
reason
Jackson.
why they're cutting you up with a halogenated ether coursing through your head, okay? There's a good reason, like life-saving, okay? So the notion that they could ban the damn things for this really minor effect on the atmosphere is outrageous. However, there was, for some reason, no pushback from the medical profession. And they're switching mostly to propofol, which is an injectable anesthetic. It's not a volatile, not a gas. And propofol used to be a great induction drug, so that you sit down, they put a cannula, they push in some propofol, you're out like this in 5 seconds, 10 maybe. And the moment you're out, they intubate you with the ethers. So it's a very pleasant induction. And in the case of short operations, like half-hour operations, it's sufficient. Just one shot of propofol, you're fine. And then you wake up feeling good, unlike how you wake up from the ether anesthesias. You wake up feeling vomitous and groggy and not very nice. So propofol, which used to be a half-hour thing, is now a 5-hour. And by the very nature of things, it's uncharted territory. We're accumulating the data. It may turn out in 10 years' time, but it's perfectly safer even than the halogens. But it may also turn out as bad news. I have no idea. But the surgeons have no choice.
That's wild.
I already made my Michael Jackson joke.
That's part of the reason why an epidural has become very popular in the US. A lot of surgeons are now realizing there's no point in subjecting the person's brain to any undue stress.
Can we talk about what the stress of this kind of treatment is? Because it's kind of so we talked to Michael Levin a little while ago, and he made the point of how incredible it is that you can basically turn off the brain, turn off conscious functioning, and then
without turning off the heart and the brainstem.
Well, okay, so this is the central problem of anesthesia. It's not what it does, what it doesn't do. Okay? What it doesn't do is screw up the rest of your body. And what it seems to be somehow miraculously focused on removing your consciousness without damaging anything else. Now, I used to think that whatever it was unique to the brain, right? The mechanism, the reason why anesthetics do that and don't, is that there's something special about the brain that anesthetics influence. It turns out that maybe much simpler than that. And the reason is this. The brain is a 24/7 user of oxygen. Unlike your muscles or indeed your gut or the skin or whatever, they don't, it never stops. Asleep, awake, doesn't make any difference. And so we know for a fact that any level of oxygenation in the brain below, let's say, I don't know exactly the number, but let's say 60, 70, percent, you start to lose it. You're groggy, you can't focus, you don't see very well, whatever. Meanwhile, your muscles are sitting happily at 50% oxygen all the time. And most of your internal organs are way anoxic compared to the brain. The brain cannot stand even 5 seconds of that. So if you had a mechanism that reduces cellular respiration by 30%, and you ask the question, let me hit every mitochondrion in your body with a drug that reduces the electron currents by 30%, let's say, what would happen? Well, the smart money would be on the brain shutting down and everything else carrying on. Okay? So this is what Nick Lane is working on right now. He's very convincingly shown, not for the first time actually, he's doing much better experiments, but the idea has been there for a while, that anesthetics reduce cellular respiration by a fixed factor. It's almost like the effect saturates. They can do 30%, but it doesn't matter how much you put on, it'll never be beyond that. Okay. Now that alone could explain general anesthesia. You cause a local hypoxia, essentially, and you lose consciousness because of that.
But actual hypoxia in the brain causes damage, right? And so if you spend 5 hours at 60%, will you come back? Let's say it's a native problem. It's not caused by anesthesia. I feel like you wouldn't come back from 6 hours at 60% and be just
No,
fine.
if it was complete anoxia, you'd be dead after about 3.5 minutes. So no, but this is a very peculiar regime. Everything's still working. You still have, you may not be producing more reduced oxygen species. I mean, we don't really know exactly how damaging it is to a cell, a brain cell, to be forced to respire at 3/4 speed or 2/3 speed. Okay.
Well, there's these Sherpas, right, who trek up Mount Everest without oxygen.
Yeah, that's right. They've adapted with blood. With mountain things,
They're still getting the same brain
the
oxygenation.
capacity of the blood to carry it.
I gotcha.
But what's interesting is, you can imagine each synapse contains a mitochondria. We know that from electron microscopy. So that dude in there must be working hard because synaptic activity is hugely energy consuming. You have to expel the vesicles, recycle the vesicles, refill them with neurotransmitter. All this stuff is a big ass machine. It makes sense for all the ATP that's necessary to make this work to come from the nearest mitochondria. Okay? It's not going to be transported down the axon. So the mitochondria are at the front line of what's happening in synapses, and for that matter, the distances between the mitochondria and the business end of the synapse is a fraction of a micron. So we're talking millisecond response times to ATP needs and to that kind of thing. So you can readily imagine that anesthesia could be explained, and I mean explained as opposed to explained away, by what Bruno van Swinderen in Australia has described as a synaptic power failure. Okay. Now, if that's how it works, terrific. But I'm a little disappointed because I was hoping something more quantum would come out of spin.
I mean, wouldn't you think that would affect the neurons in the heart and things like that too?
It does.
Okay.
Anesthetics have plenty of cardiovascular effects that are often dangerous.
But so when we were talking about this earlier in the sense of what anesthetics do, you were saying that they create this disordered spin.
Yeah.
And you think that the disordered spin is actually inside the mitochondria?
Well, if you disorder the spins, you will see what we saw in the electrochemical experiments, namely a slower reaction of oxygen with electrons. The aligned spins make that reaction go faster, as I've explained, with this sort of socket and plug. And it's wonderful that in mitochondria, maybe the electron current is spin polarized in order to feed the oxygen in the cytochrome with the correct spin. Okay, so if you disturb that, the reaction just goes to half speed. It works. It still works, but it can't go as fast because of the kinetic aspect of the spin flip.
Okay, so then it seems like there's still room for a quantum effect in anesthesia, because if it's a synaptic power failure, is the power failure being mediated by this quantum effect in the mitochondria that's slowing everything down, or you think that it's a different
Yes, it's
mechanism?
a quantum effect, yes. I mean, but I mean, given that all of life is condensed matter, there's going to be, at some level, you're bound to have some quantum effects. It's not let me just put it bluntly. If the brain is a quantum computer, okay, which is really the sort of, you know, the big question. You know, people call it the hard problem. This would be the hard question. Okay. If the brain is a quantum computer, what does that mean? Well, that must necessarily, in our present state of understanding of quantum computers, it means that the information in the brain must be stored as qubits somewhere. Okay. Electrons won't do that because their lifetime spin lifetimes a microsecond. So the fact that electrons over here are influenced by anesthetics does not affect the other question, which is the brain using qubits or not?
Do you have a sense for what the form that the qubit would take in the brain would be?
Well, if there's a guy called Matthew Fisher, who's, in my opinion, a manifest genius, who he's a super well-regarded figure in the world of quantum electronics and condensed matter of correlated electrons. And a few years ago, he proposed through a process. When you read his papers, it's a bit like Sherlock Holmes. You know, he eliminates, you know, the dog that didn't bark, and then the one that did, and then no dogs, and then we move on. You know, you read his paper, and it's such an incredible story of brilliant guesstimates of things. Okay, and he comes to the conclusion that given the available stuff, the only place you could store a qubit is a phosphorus atom, because a nuclear spin, that is. And if you read his papers, he proposes a particular type of molecule, calcium phosphate, that is, he believes, the qubit carrier in the brain. So he thinks that the brain is a quantum computer, that the qubits are phosphorus complexes. And I know Matthew Fisher. He would be, I mean, if there was a disproof for this, he'd be the very first one to say, yeah, it's toast. So he's not, you know, doesn't fit the description of the, if you want, the unhappy scientist, because he's so prominent in his field that everybody read that paper, and you know, and they're open-minded about it. I mean, some neuroscientists find it objectionable, but that's their problem. So that's the qubit. So the electrons, a spin polarized electron current over there in the mitochondria may or may not have anything to do with that. It's hard to say.
And where would the anesthetics come in?
Well, so again, if the anesthetics perturb respiration by a constant factor, maximal factor, okay, if they can only achieve 30% reduction, 30% reduction of respiration will affect every mitochondrion in the body, including those in the synapses. And because those parts are the busy bits of the neuron, synaptic activity will cease. And then you lose consciousness.
But the structure of, let's say, the qubits, these calcium phosphates, remains.
That's a different story.
They're not. You don't relate them to one another.
Well, I mean, okay.
Because I mean, that seems to be the place, that the reservoir that remains. That once you reboot the computer, so to speak, that everything kind of just.
Well, the biggest miracle of anesthesia, apart from the fact that you don't feel pain, is that you remember who the hell you are when you wake up.
Yeah, like how does that not just get wiped?
Well, if Matthew Fisher is correct, the phosphorus spins can store the information for very long periods. So even though you've messed up your mitochondria, those spins are still doing their mysterious quantum computing job. And when you restart the nerve impulses, they're still in that state.
So then presumably, if this is the case, then you should be able to put somebody under anesthesia, send like a large electromagnetic pulse through the brain to disorder the quantum states and wipe the slate clean.
Yes, maybe. But we already know that 7 Tesla magnetic fields do nothing.
Right, so that's the point that I'm trying to ask. So it's like, if that is the case, then doesn't that suggest it's more complicated than just qubits?
Well, first of all, let me just say, more complicated than just qubits. It's a truly
Yeah, we haven't even defined a qubit in this conversation.
it makes me want to just give up, retire, and go home because the qubit thing is so complicated already. If you were just merely qubits, I'd be so pathetically grateful.
Well, I mean, I guess I see it as the stand-in where I'm like, there's a network of states, and the states remain, and they're encoded in some physical molecule. And so because the state remains, it's the network that gives rise to the patterns.
Oh,
and
right.
And so I'm
And
like,
that's that
like
would
the
be
details deserve to be sketched out from that.
no, wait. The standard explanation right now, right, would be yes, it's a synaptic power failure. Each synapse has a certain probability of firing a weight, if we're using neural network terminology. And the weights are biochemically encoded into things like phosphorylation of proteins. In other words, they're written as covalent bonds into the structure of that particular synapse. So small wonder that you wake up a few hours later and you remember who you are, because those chemical bonds that determine what the brain will do at the next operation haven't been broken. Okay. If you try and do that with spins, it's a much trickier thing, So you cannot, for example, rule out, God forbid, that exposing an anesthetized person to strong magnetic field pulses or fields would really screw things up. I dread to imagine. I don't know that anyone's. Have people done general anesthesia in an MRI? They must have done.
I would guess so. At least
They
animals.
must have done. They must have done it on animal
Yeah,
for sure.
for sure.
But there is a distinct possibility that one day. I mean, I always said to my late colleague Marshall Stoneham, I said one day, because of all these radiologists wanting to spend money, we will have a 270 Tesla MRI, and the first guy to walk in there will be wiped clean.
And that's what they said about the early ones too. They were terrified. We
Yeah,
actually have
they're
a friend who developed he like doubled the power of the MRI machine back in the 90s. And he had to put his own, I think he ended up putting his postdoc or somebody put their own head in it to prove that it
The
was
postdoc. You're not supposed to do that.
He did.
Oh, it was him?
He did.
Okay,
He did.
okay.
Everybody,
Okay, good.
Everybody.
I mean, yeah, there was some story about the postdoc. I can't remember.
I think that they were worried that it was going to fry his brain like a microwave oven.
It sounds to
Yes,
me
absolutely.
there's two
It's
systems.
interesting because the same thing happened to me. I was talking to the guy who discovered transient magnetic pulse, stimulation. It's a magnetic pulse stimulation of the brain. And when they discovered it and they tested it, on their arm nerves, and it causes tremendous twitches, and so it's working, right? Even at a decent distance. And then they had to say, we're going to put it on the head, right? And he said we're all kind of, humming and hawing because they didn't know what it would do. So he said he was really worried that it might actually erase something. So he gingerly turns up the juice. He puts it on the back of his head and he turns up the juice and he starts seeing phosphines in the field of vision, little bars of light. Okay, so everything's cool. That's what you'd expect. You know that from cortical stimulation. And then he moved to the motor area and he turned off the thing rather slowly, and his fingers start moving. Okay, he starts getting twitch in the extremities. So all good. And then he moves it to the frontal cortex, which is naturally the seat of the soul, right? And he turns up the thing to maximum, and nothing.
Mm. That's what I'm thinking, is that there's a different system for who you are, your memory structure, right? Versus your awareness and your perceptual systems. And the perceptual one, it would make sense that it would be very transient and wouldn't need to necessarily keep track of what's happened before. If you have structurally encoded information like neural plasticity and all these things responsible that are covalent in nature, essentially, that would all be fine afterwards, even if you scramble everything, because it seems like the model that you're proposing is like I still want to fit spin into this, but that there's an electrical circuit that's essentially grounded through oxygen, like grounded out to oxygen. And that if you mess with the spin state of oxygen circuits, you get decreased conductivity. And so you lower the voltage and something's going on. So it's like
lower the current, not the voltage.
Okay, sorry. Lower the current. V equals IR. So, all right. Yeah. So is that the basic floor plan of the idea? That how can you fit spin into this for me a little bit tighter?
Spin into the current thing?
Yeah. Well, just into how does disrupting spin lower the conductivity? What's the
Oh,
link there?
it doesn't necessarily lower the conductivity of the wire, so to speak, but it will lower the reaction rate of oxygen, because if the spins are random, then this two electron reaction with aligned spins will happen less frequently. It's very simple. The reaction must proceed with aligned spins, and it's an instantaneous two electron reaction. Therefore, if your spins are not aligned, it simply will work less often.
Oh,
So
I
that's
see.
actually pretty. I mean, okay, I'm sure that a proper electron transfer specialist would scream in horror at what I've just said, because electrochemical reaction of oxygen at at an electrode, the two electron reaction is a fiendishly complicated process. So what I've just described is a completely cartoonish version. But if spin is involved, it will generally have that effect.
Hmm.
I mean,
Yeah, because the relationship between spin and charge is such a nightmare. Like I've tried to go down the rabbit hole of that. Of course, everybody thought it was related at first, and then
well, there's even
Well,
the fact that spin is
spin is
supposed to
related.
be a hypothetical.
No, spin is related to fundamental symmetry properties, of course, of the things that you're dealing with. Many people always warn you that the electron spin is not really a rotation, and I've heard that a million times. And it turns out that there are people who know a hell of a lot about the Dirac equations and some terms in the Dirac equation that suggest a rotation.
The
how's
reason
the
the,
angular momentum component?
the reason that they moved away from spin being a true rotation is because the size of the electron
Yes, absolutely. The
as
point. That's right. It's a point light particle, so it cannot jolly well spin because a point doesn't spin, right?
even if you give it some minute dimensions,
Yeah,
this
no, but it's actually point like so far as anyone knows. However, what it can do is go in a circular orbit at
mhm.
enormous, and that's what Hestenes, a great Swedish physicist, has been proposing. That actually there's two terms in the Dirac equation. One is an oscillation called Zitterbewegung, 10 to the 20 something hertz, high frequency, and the other one is a rotation. And he identifies the circular motion, not rotation on its axis. It's a current. So there's some discussion at the edges of foundations of quantum mechanics as to whether in fact spin is yes or no some kind of rotation. But it doesn't matter from an experimental standpoint. It is what it is. It has a magnetic moment, and you measure it.
And does seem to be related to conductivity and charge in some nebulous fashion as well.
Well, only in spintronics. I mean, this is the huge thing about spintronics, is that spin had never been used very much.
Well, even in chemical reactivity, right? If you have these unpaired spin
Spin is
orbitals,
conserved. Spin is conserved in chemical reactions, just like mass.
but do you know what I mean? If you have spin paired shells, they're not reactive. They don't.
That's right.
They
In fact,
they
we
don't
are
react to
very
magnetic
lucky that
fields.
oxygen is a ground state triplet, because if it suddenly reverted to the normal one up, one down, everything would burst into flames, because singlet oxygen is much more reactive than oxygen.
Mm.
So it's just due to this weird ass thing of quantum mechanics that things don't burn spontaneously.
But even the spin paired systems still remain quite conductive under the right pressures and so forth.
You can have
Is,
conductivity, just
yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
absolutely.
So I don't know. It's just hard for me to link the concept of spin to the concept of charge, which seems to be we're talking about a circuit here that's being interrupted somehow.
No, okay. There are two separate things here. If spin polarized electrons are traveling through a solid, the resistance to not spin polarized electrons will be higher. In other words, an electron which is polarized, let's say in the opposite direction, will find it harder to enter that solid. That's actually known now from calculations. So you can have a direct relationship between a solid of a particular handedness and electrons traveling through it in a particular direction on the one hand, and if you randomize their spins at t0, you will find the current decrease.
It's just less efficient in some sense.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, I can work with that. All right, so what's up with these radio bugs that you were working on?
Right. So one of the aspects of this whole idea of spin polarized electrons is that they can't be spin polarized forever. The moment you exit a protein, or even briefly, whatever, or go to it, you will lose your spin polarization. And that means that the population of spin locally that has been way out of equilibrium, because they're all polarized, okay, when suddenly reverts to equilibrium. And typically, a non-thermal population of spins, which is out of equilibrium with the ambient temperature, will, when returning to equilibrium, if you've pushed the population up to the higher levels, when returning to equilibrium, it can either lose the energy as heat or as radio waves. And that's the basis for pulse ESR. You take a sample, you hit it with a short, nasty, intense pulse of radio frequency, and all the spins go, not all the spins, but a good chunk of spins go up in level. And then when you turned off the RF, they decay and emit radio frequency. Okay.
Like MRI machines too.
MRI machines do it at much lower frequencies, and not gigahertz, but megahertz. But that's exactly the same thing. Okay. So my thought was this: well, if the electrons in an animal are all spin polarized, then we should be able, some of these electrons, when they return back to equilibrium, should emit radio frequencies. And those radio frequencies, because we're talking about the emission frequency in a particular magnetic field, the energy of the photons emitted is set by the magnetic field. Okay, so it's a Zeeman effect. Spin up is a different energy than spin down in a magnetic field. That difference in energies between spin up and spin down governs the energy released when you go from up to down, and therefore your emitted radio frequency photons will be at a frequency determined by you with the magnetic field. And so we just measured, we built a resonator. A colleague of mine who really knows about this stuff built a special custom-made resonator for radio frequency. And we put flies in the cavity of the resonator, which is tuned almost 100% to magnetic fields. So it was in a magnetic node. And when you ramp the magnetic field, you find that the flies, as it happens, emit radio frequency at different values of magnetic field, which is nice. But much more interesting and importantly, if you stimulate their brains by causing them to have essentially epileptic fits on demand, they emit during the fits. So there's a direct connection there appears to be a direct connection between brain activity and these pulses of radio frequency.
Didn't the anesthetics ameliorate it to some extent too?
They suppressed it completely.
That's really fascinating.
Yeah,
Okay.
I mean, it's great, but what does it mean?
Yeah, that was going to be my next question. I was hoping you could answer that.
I was going to move into the ESP direction very quickly.
Well, no, that's a legit. I mean, okay, what does it mean? It's interesting. It could be the electrons. I mean, I'm working on that right now, trying to see how to take this to the next level. I don't have a real ready answer right now.
Okay, so let me see if I can put some handles on it. So you have these, under normal conditions, there is sufficient spin polarized molecules in the brain that you can see in this resonant chamber because they send out radio waves when you relax the magnetic field.
Not quite.
Okay.
There's not molecules, it's electrons. And the magnetic field sets only the spin up, spin down difference, which will be in the radio frequency range. But the spin polarization is driven by the current, the electron current itself. So what the external magnetic field has no effect, not much effect anyway, on the spin populations. All it does is reports on the tells you that a spin flip has happened with radio frequency.
And so what do you think that it's measuring? Like you say that it's measuring the electrons, but like the electrons in the metabolic system, the electrons in every single protein, the electrons.
Oh, I see what you mean. Well, the majority of electron currents in a cell, like the 95% level, would be in mitochondria. So it's probably measuring mitochondria.
Okay, so you're able to see mitochondrial activity.
Yes.
Presumably. Okay. And so then when they undergo these epileptic seizures, you're able to see the signature of the epileptic seizure, or there's something.
I believe so. I believe so.
And then when you add anesthetic, it goes away.
Yeah.
I mean, that it makes sense. So epilepsy is an electrical condition.
Epilepsy, like both the normal state of the brain and the epileptic brain are both electrical conditions. The difference is that in the epileptic fits, the neurons are doing the last thing you want them to do, which is to fire in synchrony. That's not a desirable thing, because for a start, it's a very low entropy mode, right? I mean, imagine every neuron in your brain fires at the same time. There's no capacity for signal transmission and storage. It becomes too highly correlated. However, there's no question that during an epileptic fit, neuronal activity, each neuron goes through synchronized firing. So if you assume that we're measuring something related to instantaneous response, the mitochondrial response to energy demands, then it makes sense that the emission of RF, which we believe comes from electrons, should be following that convulsions.
I mean, the story, it as far as I can tell, the story fits together relatively well, which is that if the anesthetics are preventing this signal from being passed because they're interrupting the ability of the brain's mitochondria to actually produce the ATP that's necessary, then that aligns quite nicely, and it seems like you have a demonstration.
It's great, and the reason I don't sound really ecstatic is I was hoping for something more interesting.
What were you hoping for?
Qubits.
But that's the thing with this kind of science, is that like so much of it is interpretation, right? You have the data that you've collected, and presumably, if you call up Matthew Fisher and you spend a long time trying to figure out how to rack it onto qubits, you might be able to.
Look, I mean, what we call a nice pattern is really 3 tiny spots of light in the darkest night. So you can connect them any old way, just like the constellations.
Mm-hmm.
And people can connect these things, these factoids of neuroscience. You can draw. It's like looking at your ceiling while you're high. You can see lots of things in there.
Is there a specific arc that you hope to be able to draw, or are you more agnostic, where you simply go and explore and find the points of light that someone else will link together?
At my age, let me just sound briefly like an old fart, but at my age, you've learned that any answer is great as long as it's a good answer. Okay, so if it turns out that all that anesthesia has to do is a slight dimmer on mitochondria, then great. I'm good with that. I think that's kind of God has a sense of humor kind of thing. If it turns out to be one of the few current indications of a quantum mechanism for storing information in the brain, then terrific as well. Which one would make me happier? The quantum thing, because it's just more fun. But, if we knew more about mitochondria, we probably would discover that it's actually just as much fun.
Do you assume that mitochondria are quantum systems?
Well, everything is ultimately at some level, but I think the level will be higher for mitochondria than for other things. I suspect that condensed matter physics broadly speaking, which is very much a quantum science, will be indispensable to our understanding of the mitochondrial dynamics, mitochondrial electron and proton dynamics. The thing is a preposterously complicated machine.
Well, you also have the ability, well, if you're talking about radio waves being emitted from these mitochondria, you have a pretty rapidly available source of delocalized information networking between the different parts of the brain.
Yeah, it has to. Yeah, where's the magnetic field?
Well, I thought you were
you
saying,
have to have a magnetic field in order to
I thought you were
create
saying like
waves.
when they leave the conduits, like the materials that these.
No, they will relax, but there will be no RF emission unless there's a magnetic field around
I see.
to create the energy gap. So if what put it this way, let us suppose for the purpose of the argument that these
Well, the
are
Earth has a magnetic field. Let's.
right. So, but bringing a magnet to your head, or worse than that, going into an MRI should really screw things up. The fact that you and I can line an MRI right from the get-go without realizing the field has always been on, because of course it's always on, it's superconducting, right? And listen to some terrible 80s music through the plastic headphones and suffer through 20 minutes of 80s pop means our brain's still, unfortunately, working just fine. So can't be quantum on that level.
It could be a matter of amplitudes. There's some really interesting effects in biology where large doses do nothing, and the micro. It could be a symphony situation too, where it's all about the fine tuning of the frequencies of these radio waves and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, as an experimentalist, I'm always looking for effects that don't need statistics.
Don't blame
In
me.
the old days, the proper sort of Hodgkin-Huxley with a nerve. Yes, no. Figure one.
Those effects seem really hard to come by, though, these days.
Well, you've got to corner the beast, It's not, it was never easy. But I don't think it's getting any easier for sure.
Do you think it's getting harder?
I think the tools at our disposal are increasing exponentially, and the tools of also of data analysis are increasing exponentially. So there may be more situations than we suspect in which a proper qualitative answer is just as good as a statistical. I mean I think that works.
And if you were to give an arc to all of the research that you've done and all of the questions that you've attempted to answer, do you feel like there is an overarching question that you've been seeking the answer to?
Not a question, it's an itch. It's a general, vague, and not very well motivated, seat of the pants feeling that in my case, that you really, given the array of things that are on the shelf to build the brain, proteins, phosphorylation, ion channels, neurotransmitters, membranes, I've always had a sneaky feeling there was a missing secret sauce. That feeling could be entirely wrong.
And to clarify that, you figured that the missing ingredient is electricity?
Electrons, yeah.
Electrons specifically. Do you differentiate electrons and electricity?
Well, I mean, electricity can be carried by ions. We know that that happens in the membranes of neurons. I'm just talking about this notion that each neuron is a computer, not just an integrate and fire, and not just an adder with a time constant. That's always been, to me, a gut feeling. But you know what? Gut feelings, have been spectacularly wrong throughout history. There's no guarantee, It's not like the L'Oreal thing, because I'm worth it. I'm not worth it. I could be completely wrong.
Well, have you looked at Michael Levin's work much?
Yes, I'm not very interested in morphogenesis. I used to be working in embryology. I'm not very interested in wound healing and morphogenesis. I totally believe electrical fields can do things. These are epithelia often. You can affect their function greatly with the electric field and so on. I'm not very interested in that stuff. I'm not saying it's not interesting. I'm just saying it's not my cup of tea. But I have heard of stuff.
But not even necessarily from the morphological angle, but more from this idea of, because I feel like the discipline of biofields is very adjacent to quantum biology.
Just say this. 99.99% of it is garbage.
Yeah.
Well, who people whose ideas simply have no physical basis. Remember, biologists typically are people like myself who kind of failed physics, right? So we're selected systematically from the bottom of the pile at school. And I speak for myself here, so I don't have any problems with it. So when biologists suddenly realized that maybe the simple concepts they've been using all their lives will only carry them so far and no further, and they think some physics is required, it's a heroic effort. And I speak for myself. I'm not being disparaging. I've been, slowly learning physics at enormous expense to the taxpayer and to my colleagues. Okay? So it's a bit like the first prime minister of post-Gorbachev Russia, Chernomyrdin. He was said to have had the most expensive economics degree in history because he screwed everything up for several years. Anyway, I'm like that in a sense. I'm learning physics. Very difficult. Many people are too gullible, really, polite way of saying it, and elaborate these crazy ass theories that have no basis in physics. Physics gives you very strong constraints, like, I don't know, energies, plasma energies, electron volts, orbitals. There's a lot of stuff, rules that you're not going to break. Okay, you have to live with them. And many of these theories just completely ignore the law. This is the Wild West. I am the law. Well, yes, but it doesn't work.
But in its best form, do you think that what people are pointing to when they talk about biofields is quantum biology? Do you think that like in the pinnacle of each field, do they converge to a single point, or are they just totally?
There's no, look, explaining one mystery by another has been a favorite thing of the philosophically minded scientists since forever. Okay, so you bring in quantum mechanics, which is certainly non-trivial, and let's say consciousness, which is desperately impossible to understand. And you're hoping that you put these two together and they make great music? Maybe. And maybe not. I think as an experimentalist or even as a theoretician, you should see where the ideas lead you. You should not start with a notion the entire cosmos is made up of consciousness or whatever. You can always believe that. As a matter of fact, I do believe it. I'm a panpsychist. Okay, if I have to describe myself, that would be the closest little, tribe that panpsychist, probably a Mysterianist, in the sense that if you think it's going to be worked out in the next 20 years, make sure you keep breathing, okay? And so...
Is that just an intuition?
Sorry?
That's just an intuition, your panpsychism belief?
We're all such 19th century people. We all have, both Rudolf Steiner and Einstein somewhere in there. Okay. So it would be amazing if I didn't think that, considering the accumulated sort of philosophy of our age. So yes, I do think that, but for no very good reason. It would be nice, It would be nice. There's no question. But the thing is with science is the opposite would be nice as well.
Well, I think that there's no other, and I'm going to expose my own philosophical convictions here, but I think that there's no other way to build a universe. There's no other way to create a universe where all of the sudden consciousness just kind of snaps into being. It must be built from simpler parts because that's how everything works.
Look, there's a wonderful article came out recently. I only read part of it, but it was magnificent. It's a complete compendium of all the theories of mind. Catalog. It's a taxonomy of theories of mind. It's an outstanding piece of scholarly work. And you realize that, the range of theories of mind is so gigantic. Physical range, like consciousness is the primordial matter of the universe. Matter itself is a sort of an afterthought. And what we do when we're conscious is we tap into some small subset of this universal consciousness. Okay, that's one end. I don't even know what they call it. I don't care. They have perfectly good names for them. Philosophers are good at naming things, and it's very useful. At the other end, there's the consciousness is an emergent property of synapses, in essence, and action potential. Okay, now, if the range of theories that are, at least in good part, consistent with the facts at this point is that wide, don't give me any theory for a while. Let me just add another couple of data points to constrain this crazy ass Weierstrass curve. And when we have a smooth thing, then I'll start worrying.
It seems like the reason that consciousness has even become a popular field of study is deeply tied into the technological implications. I think that if I can trace the provenance of it, it seems to be inexorably tied to computation and the desire to create an artificial consciousness. And so as the technologists have needed it,
I take your point. I think there were really two phases to this thing. The first phase from 1950, 55, 59, that kind of thing, all the way to the 1980s was the phase of hallucinogens. People who were into computers were also taking a lot of drugs. Okay, this is a fact. They saved the world. All these acid heads, including Steve Jobs for that matter, really made a difference to the whole conceptual apparatus of consciousness, altered states, all that stuff. Really, really important. They were also computer nerds. Okay, many of them, because that was the expanding, the frontier of both of practical computing and of theoretical computer science and artificial intelligence. Okay. If you take acid or hallucinogens, you become aware of the workings of your brain in a way which is very compelling. And so it's normal to, when you come down, to start thinking, well, what did I see? What are these shapes in DMT that are always the same for everybody? That kind of stuff. It's neuroscience. But it's also computation. And then what happened was neural networks, of course, and large language models and all that stuff, and all the AI thing. And those two things kind of collided, and it's become, for that and possibly other reasons to do with neuroscience, it's become possible to talk about consciousness in a polite conversation among neuroscientists without being considered a dangerous element. Okay. And my colleague Christoph Koch, who's a very eminent neuroscientist and was the head of the Allen Institute of Neuroscience in Seattle until recently.
He's coming on the show next week?
I think so.
Great. Okay. So he's actually put his money on the quantum brain. And he and I and various other people are working together on this at the moment to do with questions of spin in consciousness, to do with, in fact, xenon gases. You can ask him about that. See if he can tell you. I'm under sort of embargo to discuss this stuff at the moment. So, but Christoph is in charge, so he might actually spill the beans, quantum ones. So, right now there's a huge interest. All this minority acid head thing, they're now running the world. Okay, from San Francisco and the Bay Area. So naturally, their worries and concepts and everything are now everywhere. And that's where quantum neuroscience really comes out of. But even if I hear you talk, both of you, you clearly are you're tuned to that particular radio, which is a very important one right now.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think the word quantum gets abused in all the time, right? So it's worth sorting out. I think the word quantum gets abused. Like, people will tack quantum onto any particular discipline just to make it sound cool. And you have to really dig down. I mean, they're talking about atomics at the end of the day. And like Anastasia mentioned at the beginning, or much earlier, that the atomic models of what's physically happening at the atom, like what even an electron is, those are really interesting questions to us.
Absolutely. But just to comment on what you said, quantum is being served up in every different kind of context. Yes, but the same was true of molecular. Okay, molecular biology, give me a break. Or for that matter, systems biology. Okay, which is another egregious piece of vacuum. What is systems biology? It used to be called physiology, now it goes, whatever. But people use, in order to get money, it was like, in the old days, you had to collect your friends as a group, give them each a spear, and then go plunder someplace. Okay, scientists are like that. In order to get cash, you have to have a name for the damn thing you're working on, so that so that often with a delay or several years, it becomes the thing. See, I was accidentally there at the very beginning of quantum biology. Actually, no, the real beginning was 1923, 25. Okay, but let's leave that aside. The rebirth was 1987. I'm sorry, 2007. Sorry, 2007. 2007, big paper in Nature about photosynthesis and the quantum beats in photosynthesis. Greg Engel is the first author, and DARPA notices this new and interesting field, possibly with technological applications, and decides to create a big program on quantum biology. Greg turns around and asks people, what the hell is quantum in biology apart from photosynthesis? And after the first 24 people, somebody says to him, well, magnetic navigation of birds, possibly quantum. And I heard there's this crazy dude who says that the olfaction is quantum. Okay. And so he got us the bird man, Peter Hoare from Oxford, and the smell man, myself. We together wrote the first white paper for DARPA on quantum biology. So, it was a good name to sell an idea, really.
Well, yeah, it's kind of a drop-down list when you're applying for these grants. You got to fit your research into one of these bins. So I guess
Well,
it makes
that
sense.
bin, for the longest time didn't exist, and actually it doesn't really exist even now, because if you look at the major research councils, including the NIH and so on, no one has a study group that corresponds to the interest of quantum biology. It's going to happen, but it hasn't happened yet.
Okay, so you said something interesting earlier where you were like, hey, it's really dangerous in the science to replace an idea with something that you don't really understand very well. And
Did I say,
uh
did I say that?
I'm probably not paraphrasing you correctly. I have a tendency of mushing these ideas together. But it seemed like what you were saying is that what happens is that there's a popular paradigm, and then there's something that's fashionable that gets, when people can't figure it out for long enough, it's replaced by something that seems plausible, but that it perhaps is poorly enough understood that the plausibility is hidden beneath the veil of
It's understandable.
not really getting it.
Okay, the sociology of ideas, the sort of, which is really the matter of the history of science, really, that's the subject matter, is very complicated. And it has to do, to some extent, with fashion. People get tired of one thing, eventually, with personalities, with great good fortune. It's very hard to give a standard, if you want, plot to the life, death, and miracles of a particular idea. It doesn't. It follows a very random pattern. Very often. As a scientist, you always trust in the fact that the notion, which is central to science, really, that eventually the truth prevails. If you gave up on that, the sociology would become simply unbearable.
I guess so. The reason that I ask this leading question is I sometimes worry that quantum mechanics is so paradoxical and so poorly understood that there's a danger of clicking it into biological systems, which are also deeply mysterious and poorly understood at their fundamental.
Well, that's definitely happening right now. I mean, it's definitely happening right now. When I get to read, sometimes I get to even referee occasionally papers in the general area of the interface between physics and biology, and most of them are just absolute, just nonsense. And my theory is that there is no more direct interface between physics and biology than there is a common border between China and Switzerland. You basically have to go through all of Eastern Europe and all of Central Asia, respectively, condensed matter physics and physical chemistry and chemistry itself, to connect the two. And the central science of all of the stuff that we've been talking about, the central science is chemistry. Okay? The chemistry is the Central Asian plateau. At one end, there's China, which would be physics, and at the other end is Switzerland, which would be biology, molecular biology. In the middle, it's all physical chemistry. So that my advice to any young person who wants to get into biophysics is forget the biology. Learn the physics in high school, maybe do a degree in it, but do chemistry. Because that's really what's going to crack the problem. Physical chemistry, quantum chemistry, whatever you like.
It's interesting that you say that because that wraps neatly to where we began with the transactional interpretation of quantum mechanics, because Kramer and Carver and I think Ruth Kastner all point to G.N. Lewis as one of the main originators of this idea that light must be a transaction between atoms rather than just this radiation out into empty space.
Yes, absolutely. But even just to go back to the basic tunneling effect, okay? In the mechanism that I propose for olfaction, it's inelastic tunneling, okay? So you have an electron donor level at one energy, one electron acceptor level at another energy a little bit further down. And the electron cannot tunnel through until it figures out a way to lose the energy to tunnel to the empty state. It does so when there's a molecule in the middle that can absorb that energy in a vibration. This is the principle of the electron tunneling spectrometry. But here's the weird ass thing. You've got an electron, you've got a molecule, you have the energy level. How does it know? How does the electron on the left know that there's an energy level available on the right? Okay? Fundamentally, this is in many ways close to the central problem of quantum mechanics, which is electrons do what's possible. How do they know what's possible? Okay? And the answer that Ruth Kastner and Kramer and other people bring is that the exchange, the movement of the electron is the result of a complicated series of handshakes between the starting point and the end point. And yes, you can describe them as amplitudes, as coefficients in the matrix, as whatever you like, but that's not the ontology of it. The ontology is that the electron is actually probing the space and the energy space beyond the barrier, actively doing so. And only when a telegram comes back that says, yep, ready to roll, does the thing happen. Okay, that's transactional quantum mechanics. And tunneling, I think, is a perfectly, inelastic tunneling is a really excellent illustration of the difficulties of the sort of standard explanation, so to speak.
I mean, you could ask the same question about water. How does water know where to flow when the dam breaks?
Well, I mean, you can.
Yeah, it's got to be a dissipative process at the end of the day.
There's a bit of a difference there because you can actually simulate that really easily. Even in the mid '60s, they were doing very, very good waterfall simulations with very simple point-like molecules with whatever Leonard-Jones potentials between them and that kind of stuff. So that actually has a kind of intuitive feel. The thing that we're describing here, which is a quantum handshake that happens essentially instantaneously without any visible effects other than it makes the thing happen. Okay? That's really amazing.
Yeah, for me, it just has to come down to we have to stop reifying pieces of the atom, actions of pieces of the atom into things like electrons.
We have to probably reify them in a different way. I mean,
I think we need a structural explanation, really. Like, we need a structural model of the atom. Yeah.
I'm with you totally, but I think when we have the structural explanation, we'll be reifying things again, but with the correct structure or more. I mean,
we'll never get to the bottom of we'll never get to the apps. I mean, there's always probably more complexity to a structure, but if we keep treating these exchanges as these bowling balls of electrons, it becomes impossible to actually come up with structural solutions. At some point, you end up with stuff going backwards in time and all sorts of wacky stuff.
My only slight hesitation about the transactional is that I don't see a lot of equations in their books.
I think they just use the basic Schrodinger mathematics.
No, I know, but there's not enough equations really to put one's mind completely at ease, because an equation suggests.
Well, it's not a theory
Sure.
too, right? Like that's
Right.
what they'll always come back to is
yeah.
it doesn't make
peculiar
new
kind of theory, 'cause it's
predictions.
a bit like the Bohm, the guiding wave, the Bohmian theory. It matches quantum mechanics by design, point by point. You don't expect to find a clear experimental difference, okay? Because it happens orthogonally to quantum mechanics. But at the same time, at some point, you have to say to me, look, if transactional is correct, this should happen in this way rather than that way. The same happened as with the Bell inequality. For the longest time, it was believed that no experiment could settle the issue. And then bingo, Bell thinks about it and you can. Transactional, I think, if it's going to go anyplace, must surely at some point make an experimental prediction.
He mentioned
Otherwise-
one yesterday. What was the start with an A? It's like a Russian last name guy. Do you remember?
Must be Russian.
End of the conversation. I don't know. They had this experiment where they were basically trying to compare a double slit experiment by putting electric wires where the fringe.
I've seen that.
Okay.
I think it's Afshar.
And he was
Sharif
trying to make the
Afshar.
Right.
claim that this only made sense under the transactional model.
That's
But-
right. The Afshar experiment. That's described in Ruth Kastner's books. I'm not good enough to figure out who's right on that one.
I didn't get a chance to read about it yet, but I mean, I think when you do an interpretation, you're necessarily reinforcing the theory from whatever interpretation you do. Like the quantum theory stands, it makes testable predictions, but your interpretation kind of overlays on that. And the only thing you can do is say that a given interpretation fails to recapture some observable, right? So interpretations can fail, but they can't ever really totally succeed because there's no way of directly testing them. So
No, but it would be nice if the equivalent of the Bell inequality were invented for transactional. I mean, there are experiments. The transactional quantum mechanics is, of course, not the only game in town. There's a dozen fundamental theories, and I think that some of them have experiments that may be soon feasible or that kind of thing.
Mhm.
The
I'd love
one
to
that
learn more
doesn't
about
is
those.
the one that doesn't, so far as I understand it, is string theory. The experiments exist, but they're out of reach in energy.
Yeah, I don't know. There's so much more to say. I guess we're almost at 3 hours here. I honestly could talk to you more.
Yeah, I mean these are really interesting questions to us. I think that it's we had a really interesting experience the other day where, do you know who David Graeber is?
Yes,
So
I have his book.
we started reading Utopia of Rules because we wanted to do a discussion about it. And the Utopia of Rules is about it's Graeber's criticism of bureaucracy and the way that it kind of encompasses us and envelops us. And it's really funny because it's almost impossible to talk about, because he's like, there's no theory yet for how to talk about it. And so all of us, when we sit down to try to discuss it, are left with insufficient vocabulary for the critique that we wish to have. And so Shiloh and I are now trying to figure out, how do you have a conversation about something where the vocabulary is not yet there? And there's so many different moving pieces. And I feel like this is consciousness and quantum mechanics and quantum biology. These are all places where economics. There's intuitions and there's senses for how these things fit together, but it's very hard to settle on a place where you can plant a flag and then confidently just philosophize about what that flag means, because the flag
I
has
don't
no
think-
place to plant.
I don't think philosophy. I mean, philosophy would be nice, but it's optional. I think what's needed is hard scientific experiment. I think we've had enough philosophy to last us 5 centuries about the brain.
It's funny
I think-
because the philosophers say that we've had enough data collected to last us 5 centuries.
They don't understand data. They don't understand data. I think philosophers, because so much of philosophy has to do with essentially a delusional instinct that you can think You can see the same things everybody's seen since forever and think something completely new, which is highly unlikely. They don't really think the whole existence of philosophy is in some ways predicated on an indifference to fact.
The ideal philosophy would not be.
Right. Okay. But what I'm saying is it's not like philosophers are more often than not, philosophers are not the sorts of people who change their minds easily when faced with new facts. Okay. Because they operate at a level where facts don't matter quite in the same way. Okay. So disproving a philosophical theory with a fact is non-trivial. You know, I mean, you can dismiss them for all manner of reasons, but to disprove them is quite another. So I guess what I'm saying is that philosophers think that we have enough data because they don't understand what the experiments say.
That's possible. But I also think it's significant that as a scientist, you get a doctorate of philosophy. I don't think that that's an accident, because I think that, and I want to try this out on you, and you can tell me how wrong you think it is. I think that science is a form of myth making. You look out onto the world, you collect these stars in the night sky, and you draw a constellation, and then you tell a story about where that constellation came from. And that requires a philosophical bent, because you cannot tell a story without the metaphysics behind it and without the rules by which you tell the story influencing the outcome that you have. And so the best scientists in my mind are the ones that are exceptional at understanding data and then have the preternatural ability to weave that story, that myth that captures the heart and mind and transmits intuition into something that is not just a gut feeling, but is actually an argument.
Okay.
I mean, yeah.
Okay. I mean, you touched on a lot of different things there. Some of which I agree, some of which I'm not sure I fully understand, but the story has to match the facts.
Mm.
And any story that doesn't really is flying on fumes. Really, they're eventually going to run out.
But you can tell multiple stories based on the facts. That's what a trial is all about, right?
I actually feel that what you've said is true of all intellectual endeavor. Every single thought we've ever had is, in some sense, projecting a story onto often either unconnected or connected differently facts. Okay, that's fine. That's the human condition. In science, there is always this hope that the facts will confirm will agree with one particular theory and violently disagree with all the others, so that, in a sense, a whole class of fairy tales will be wiped out from the face of the earth, never to come back again, which we haven't done really with ordinary fairy tales. We still look at the constellation, we still have our star sign, but the things that were simply wrong in science are really gone. That's the whole point. So all this, in a sense, all this nasty activity that tries to prevent new ideas from gaining grounds is also part of the garbage collection effort. At least that's the people who are most conservative about science really believe themselves to be very useful, and they are.
I like that. I think that this is as good of place as any to put a pin in it for now. I love how you write. I really enjoyed your Substack. I really enjoyed the talks that you gave. There's a certain amount of whimsy in the way that you look at nature, which I think is very beautiful.
Thank you. I really strongly believe that if whatever you're doing is not fun, you shouldn't do it. There really are two modes of operation in science in general. There's work, and then there's fun. Okay, so for example, the first guy to calculate an orbital density on a molecule that may say, let's say, Millikan or Popel, I don't know who it was, but some Nobel Prize winning quantum chemist from the 1950s. That was work, man. They spent 6 months and they got an electron density map of the water molecule, and they went around screaming, okay, for a day or two. And now we just do it on a laptop in 15 seconds. That's not work, that's fun, okay? And there's a very, very sharp boundary for all technology where suddenly something that used to be work becomes fun. And all the professionals who've been working on it feel cheated because now any cretin like me can get a quantum chemistry software and futz around with it. But that's the fundamental thing that makes science advance is when you turn work into fun. That's my principle. So if you say whimsy, yes, I want things to be fun.
I love that. Well, thank you for taking the time to share that with us.
Pleasure. Thank you, both of you.
Yeah, I'm excited to try these ideas on with some of the other people we're going to be meeting with. It's been,
so who are you going to be meeting with? Nick Lane? You're already done.
We should get back to Nick Lane and do another one. I don't know. I mean, we're still have to talk to Ruth. We should circle back with Carver again. In the biology world,
we're looking for. I mean, I wrote down a lot of the names.
Right?
Yeah, Christoph Koch. I wrote down a lot of the names that you mentioned. We're working on getting John Clauser, who got the Nobel Prize for the Bell's inequality. Ideally, we'd get him and Kramer together because Kramer has a lot of criticisms, and Clauser has known about them all along.
That would be a terrific battle of ideas, and I'm sure they're both really, really fine scientists. I think you'll be having a good time there. That's wonderful. What a wonderful thought. But actually, Kastner is a highly articulate. She's a philosopher, you know. She's she's the real thing. She's an ontologist of quantum mechanics with a strong philosophical background. So when you read her books, there's no messing around in terms of categories of thought. She's really, really, really good. So you should have her on. She's brilliant. I'll watch it for sure.
Amazing. Yeah, I think we meet with her in like an hour to set up the
I think it might be a half an hour actually.
She's also a fanatical left winger, far way to the left of just about anybody in Europe now.
Interesting. We try to avoid we try to avoid politics with mixing politics and science. It seems.
Yeah, I know, and I think so does she. I mean, I don't think her science is influenced by that, but I also see her on Twitter, you know, being way to the left of Bernie Sanders, for example, that kind of stuff.
That's really interesting. It's funny because everybody accuses us of being a right-wing podcast. And
what? Why?
They call us hippies too. So
yeah, it's a very schizophrenic.
Wait, who said you were right-wing and why?
We've had multiple people leave the show or like patrons leave notes that, you know, you guys play with too many right-wing ideas. I think that we've done conversations where we're suspicious of the superficial narratives about climate change and global warming. I think that we've done.
Boy, am I ever glad we didn't go there in this podcast.
I mean, we were pretty unhappy with the way COVID went too.
I've made a lot of
puts
enemies
you in the right wing bin.
I was just earlier. I was saying to my wife that I was once invited at the Perimeter Institute in Waterloo, and they did a big dinner, you know, essentially in my honor. I mean, you know, 15 people around the table, really great food. It was super nice. And then someone says to me, "What's your feeling about global warming?" And I had a couple of drinks. Okay, so I was in a fairly. Also, the dinner was in my honor, so I was pumped up. You know, probably overconfident. Anyway, I said, "Well, it strikes me that you guys could do with a couple of degrees. To be honest, you Canadians could really do with a couple of degrees because we're freezing our butts." Okay, and this went down like a lead balloon. It was all I could do to recover from this faux pas for the next hour.
I have a theory, which is that many civilizations have crumbled because of climate change, like local climate change, local degradation, and it's a really real threat to civilizations. And that a lot of civilizations have spent a lot of time throwing virgins into volcanoes in the hopes of reversing it.
Absolutely, yeah.
And I'm like, I think that that's the failure mode, and so we just need to be sure that we're throwing the right virgins in the right volcanoes.
I tell you, for me, the thing that clashes in my mind is this: the Roman warm period, the Minoan warm period, and medieval warm period were known as climate optima. What happened? And when you read European history of the 10th, 11th, 12th, 13th century, you find all these damned Normans, right? Sailing across the seas to capture Sicily and Calabria. Now, who in their right mind would want Sicily and Calabria in their present state? Arid places. The reason why the Normans were setting up principalities in southern Italy and in Sicily is that the places were green. This was during the medieval warm period, at the peak of it, in fact. So when you learn a little history and you look at the graph temperature against time of the last 1,000 years, you're bound to ask yourself a couple of questions.
And those are deeply, deeply unpopular questions to ask.
Oh, are you kidding? I'm hoping you don't, Brock. Feel free, by the way. I don't give a shit at this point. You know, I'm 70 years old. They can all go to hell. Okay. I don't really, honestly, I don't give a fuck anymore about this because I've kind of had enough of this oppressive thing. I'm not a climate scientist, but can someone please explain to me why they're sure that global warming will not give rise to greenery in Calabria again? Okay. And answer that question without using acronyms and freaking models with 600 parameters. Okay.
Well, no,
Okay, now,
nobody's going to do that because it's not
exactly.
It's not a science
So,
about the science, really. It's just
exactly. So as
about taking care of the planet, right? You're like,
exactly.
if you try to discuss the science or ask questions about the science, then you don't care about the planet. And it's like,
That's right.
That's the whole message,
I
unfortunately.
remember I had a conversation with my son when he was only maybe 12, 13, and he says to me, do you realize the sea level is going to rise by, I don't know, whatever it was, 1 meter in 100 years, and that means half of whatever, Eastern England will be underwater. I said, dude, if we can't build a seawall 1 meter high in 100 years, I hope we get wiped out.
That's a really good point.
And he stopped in his tracks and looked at me, and I said, he suddenly was like, holy shit, that's what it actually means, right? And I said, look, half of Holland is below sea level by 8, 10 meters. Are the Dutch in any way threatened? They look to me like a peaceful bunch of prosperous people. So what are you guys talking about? Anyway, this topic, I've actually quit. There are 2 topics that I completely avoid now in conversation with civilized people. The Middle East, climate change.
I'm surprised COVID's not on that list.
Well, COVID's kind of over.
No need to look there.
You know, what I mean is, compared to the Middle East, COVID is over.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. I don't know.
But anyway, climate change is diabolical. You know what I think of it? It's the affaire Dreyfus. You know, the Dreyfus affair of the 21st century. It cuts vertically down society. There are people within the same family around the dinner table who radically disagree about this, just the same way they radically disagreed about Dreyfus in France and in the rest of Europe. It's an affaire Dreyfus. So it's a reason to argue with your family, basically. So it's a,
somebody's probably making money off it too. That's usually the case.
Yeah, almost certainly.
Anyway, thank you guys.
Yeah, thank you,
really
Luca.
Let me know when you're going to plan to actually put it on air. Or
I think we're gonna get it out this week, and I think we'll get it out Sunday.
Okay, I'm terrified to see the result.
Nah,
It'll be great.
it was really fun. This is a great conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you
All
so
right,
much.
Thank
take
you
care,
both.
man.
Take care.
Bye.